So whatever, it just makes it a little bit easier. But yeah, you're in Philly. You're in Philly. Are you from that area?
I am. I am originally from outside of the city. Most of my life has been centered
Where
around.
in the suburbs?
Grew up in Devon, like Berwyn area, and then moved to Newtown Square later on. And then I went to college out in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So the most Amish county in the
Oh yeah.
United States. And I moved back and then I had a hiatus in Utah for a couple months, about a year. And then I came back to Philly right after I graduated college. So been here now for like 4.5 years in the city. South Philly the entire time. So as much of my writing is like around the country, and I have traveled quite a bit. Most of my like life that I have been in one place for has been within 60 miles of Philadelphia.
Are you a Manchester Orchestra fan, or am I outing myself as a millennial?
You're outing yourself as a millennial.
No, yeah,
Was
just
there a reason for Manchester Orchestra? Are they
they're
from
f
Philly?
from Allentown.
That checks out. That
Yeah,
is actually the most Allentown band. Wow. Now that I think about it.
yeah.
It also makes sense why they're always like I'll be driving on like 276 or something. And I'll always see it around the holidays and stuff like Manchester Orchestra live in like Reading. And I'm like, why are they always in Reading or Allentown or like up at like Mohegan Sun, like a casino in the Poconos? That makes a lot more sense.
Are you a good old war fan with that as
Am I
well?
a what?
A good old war fan? That
No,
kind
I don't know
of,
as
yeah,
well.
okay, that's my millennial stuff. I know they're from
I'm
Philly
like,
as
here I
well.
am. My favorite, like, Pennsylvania music group, I guess, Lore, which, to be fair, I live in Philly, so there's obviously, like, a ton of bands from here. Like, you've got any sort of, if I start naming, like, any sort of, like, again, I'm gonna say, like, mid to late millennial emo band. If I say, yeah, I don't think I need to elaborate on that. Oh my God. So modern baseball, so on
Oh
and so forth.
yes.
I came of age, if you will, at like the very tail. I'm 27, so at the very tail end of that. But it means now I can be like, I saw Japanese Breakfast in a basement, or like Mac DeMarco's guitarist in a like basement house show back in like 2017 or something, or Alex G. I think I've ended up
Yeah.
seeing way too many times for that reason. But my favorite part of this is like going to school in Lancaster. There's so many like either sort of metalcore bands from Lancaster or like Christian rock bands, but like I think August Turns Red is one of them or something. There's so many of those that like I feel like have that same sort of ilk. And um they used to throw like some big like Christian metalcore festival in which of course is in Lancaster like every year. It's really funny.
Yeah, the reason I ask is one, I'm always just curious because I live in Vegas now, but I'm
Okay,
from
I was gonna
Baltimore.
ask.
Yeah. I grew up
Gotcha.
in born and raised in the suburbs of Baltimore, yeah.
That, yeah, I was gonna
So
say.
Philly was a part of my lexicon in terms of that. You know, the sister city, obviously, but have you been to Baltimore? I'm probably if you're
I
from
have,
Philly. Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
I've actually mostly been to Baltimore to go see shows in
Exact
Baltimore.
same reason we would go to Philly. Yeah.
Yep,
They kind of have similar vibes. Philly's much
they do.
bigger, obviously, but I don't know. Whenever I go to Philly, I'm always just like, yeah, this is just like a bigger like Baltimore. It is the same kind of Catholic city, very Catholic kind of
Yes.
Catholic schools everywhere, Catholic universities everywhere. Baltimore is a really Catholic city, which I didn't realize until I moved away. But yeah, that's just interesting because I do that because you know the last time I was in Philly is when my wife and I we weren't married yet, but we were dating, right? And she's from DC. She
Mhm.
took me to the Electric Factory in Philly there,
Oh my
and we
God.
saw Brian Fallon. It was during his first solo album, after Gaslight Anthem had their little hiatus. Was that Painkillers, I think was the name of the album. And so I went, my wife took me there, and I saw the members of Good Old War were just at the bar, like hanging out. And I was just like, oh yeah, because they're from Philly. So of course Brian Fallon's in town. They're gonna come to the show.
Yep.
So I was just curious about all that. And that makes me, yeah, like I said, out myself as a millennial. I think I'm about 10 years older than you. I'm 36. So yeah, modern baseball, those bands were just so, and I always say this too, it's going to come up as we get into the interview here,
Yeah.
Audrey, but like there's a mid-Atlantic sound, especially in that 2010s era with the end of the emo into this kind of, what would you call that kind of emo pop rock, that kind of like modern baseball style.
Yeah, like the modern baseball, Glockamora,
Yeah,
Snow,
yes,
like
exactly.
somehow I used to be so into this and I'm not anymore because I'm not in
It doesn't
college.
exist. It doesn't exist anymore, Audrey.
It doesn't.
Yeah, yeah.
It like went through like, people point to waves or whatever, and that was very much, I think, like that third wave where it was like, okay, it's somewhat derivative of say your pop punky, and I was never a pop punk person,
Oh,
but
I
like
love it. I loved it.
you're
Yeah.
I was gonna say not to tell a millennial I don't like pop punk, sign of the cross, but definitely like you hear the like MCR like Fallout Boy E Warped Tour sound in it, but
Yeah.
it's a lot almost like grungier in a way, which is, lyrically I would say it's closer to something like pop punky, but I get what you're saying, and it doesn't exist anymore. It completely got wiped out by this like sort of like slacker rock sound, like you're getting your Alex
Yeah.
G of the world, which is your Mac DeMarco's of the world, Viceroy cigarette and a cap, like a baseball cap era of 2017. And that's what I mostly grew up in. But it was definitely a pipeline.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always say it's very distinct because there is that, okay, there's the California pop punk where it's
Yes.
Blink-182 and all those kind of people. Yeah, and I love Blink-182. I always say they're still one of my favorite bands, even though they're geriatric now. And I like the Tom DeLonge Blink-182. I refuse to acknowledge the Matt Skiba Blink-182 because it's so awful. But there's so there was a sound in California that we did that, and but then there was like the mid-Atlantic sound where there was the kind of poppier, very emo stuff was coming out of, yeah, Baltimore, Jersey, and then Philly, like kind of up the coast. When you
Yes.
get to New York, it's kind of so big that there's too many scenes to kind of have a one sound from New York, like Matt and Kim shit that was happening at the time. Again,
The
those are my college
Williamsburg.
years, so that's why I know
Yeah.
all of it. But it's just like as you move up that coast, there is a sound, and it maybe even goes all the way down to kind of North Carolina to Jersey, kind of on that coast. A very specific sound from that time. My Chemical Romance came out of Jersey at that time. Like all of these kind of, like you said, it was a little grungier, a little harder, not as clean as that kind of pop rock that was coming out of Southern California, which of course, Southern California, it's beautiful. I mean, whenever you go, like living in the Southwest now, it's always like, oh yeah, this is why people live here. It's gorgeous all the time. Like it's partly
Yeah.
cloudy is a bad day. Like it's just like,
I think particularly for Southern, like the Southwest. And again, I spent some time in Utah, very different from California or like Nevada. And I would move back there in a heartbeat. I'm actually head back there at the end of the month. I love it so much. But every time, I've only been to California in particular a few times. And a lot of times I'm like, why would anyone want to live in California? Like, the government's horrible, it's expensive, like yada yada yada. San Francisco just seems like an utter nightmare in terms of like safety and the types of people that are there, yada yada, so on. And then like I took a train through California last year and I was like, oh, I get it. Like
yeah.
it's constantly 60, 75 degrees and sunny. And everyone's like beautiful and sort of delusional and health obsessed. And I'm like, oh, okay, I got it now. But I think on the, it's sort of like the perfect breeding ground for something like, your Blink 182s of the
Yeah.
world. Because when everything is sort of just that beautiful and perfect, you're obviously going to have the equal and opposite reaction in terms of the disaffected teenager, which
Yeah.
was most of Orange County at that time. So I completely get why California has its appeal. And also why I always say like, and this is going to make me sound very woo-woo, but that veil being thinner out in the Southwest. I'm like, I completely get that now. And I think that's why like New Mexico in particular breeds so many writers and artist types as well.
Or at least attracts them from other
It tracks
places. Like
exactly.
I always think of who is the painter? What's her name?
Georgia O'Keeffe.
Georgia O'Keeffe, yeah, which she has all those famous quotes about living in the Southwest, which she didn't grow up there, she wasn't from there, but as soon as she
Yeah.
saw it, she was like, yeah, I'm never leaving. Like I'm never
Yeah.
leaving Arizona or whatever. Like the red
I think she was
clay.
in Santa Fe in
Oh,
particular.
Santa Fe, yeah.
But yeah,
Same, yeah, same
exactly.
shit. When you drive through that landscape, once you get past Texas. Uh,
Basically, once you get below that plateau of like Zion and Bryce in Utah, and it's just again the red rocks, that flat sort of hilly. It's beautiful. I love it out there. And I'm always like, if I lived somewhere else in the United States, which to be fair, I would not live anywhere else on the East Coast besides Pennsylvania. I'm a Pennsylvania like truther through and through. I would go
really?
to the Southwest in a
Even
heartbeat.
even the Carolina coast and stuff, you're not
So actually my mom's side of the family is all in North Carolina and
it's the best beach on the East Coast, yeah.
I love Wilmington. I would if I was to do anywhere else on the East Coast, it would probably be like North Carolina because I also like that side of the family in the South. I have, I love them and I do have such a soft spot for the South as well. I could maybe swing. I said maybe swing like it would be Maine, but that's what the summer is for, I guess. But I always think, yeah, I would go back to like Utah or somewhere in New Mexico probably. But also like I growing up in Pennsylvania, I am like, oh, I'm in Pennsylvania. This is so boring. What happens here? And now as an adult, I am like, it's so beautiful. Like whenever anyone talks about like how beautiful America is, it's always some photo of like State College,
Yeah.
Pennsylvania. And I am just every time I leave this, I love Philly. Like I'll hold it for its faults. I will be very honest about that, but it's still a gorgeous city. And going outside to like the suburbs or anywhere else, I'm like, Pennsylvania's great. We don't have any weird weather problems. It's beautiful. There's a lot to do. You can go to New York, you can go to the beach in Jersey. Fantastic. Love it. So,
Yeah. Yeah, that's I mean it just yeah, I just like whenever I meet somebody from the mid-Atlantic, I'm always just like, yeah, so the and what's funny when I was in grad school and all of that, I always say this, but it's like the people that I naturally gravitated towards and we're just meeting people like the first week or
yeah.
whatever, all these people you're gonna spend the entire couple years with. I was just gravitating towards and then I find out where they're from. Oh, they're all from the mid-Atlantic, kind of
Yeah.
northeastern area. Like there's just a little pocket right there. Like even being out here on the West Coast, there's just a sensibility of like it's so laid back and I'm much more neurotic. Like I'm like an East Coaster where it just it's
Yes.
like, don't you have somewhere to be? Don't you have somewhere to be? Why are you just
Why aren't you doing
leisurely?
something?
Yeah, like aren't you just leisurely walking down the street, blocking it for everybody else?
Exactly.
Move, like your fucking flip-flops to work, you fucking California. Like I'm just like, there's just a sense of something that like you get that when you're out there on the Northeast Mid-Atlantic area.
And they're all like, why are you freaking out? And
Yeah, they're
like,
like,
why aren't you
relax,
doing
bro.
anything? Why aren't you moving out
Uh,
of my way? Why are you like calm? Like, it's so funny. And I definitely, it's funny whenever I'm traveling too. I don't really have as much of an accent, I think, but whenever I'm meeting someone new or I'm in a place that I'm not familiar with or I don't know, I have like a very distinct sort of Delco-y, Philly-y accent that
yeah,
just flies out. I remember I was at a diner in like Albuquerque, New Mexico last year, again on this train situation. And I was there for like one day, like all like 1.5 days. And I was at this diner and I'm ordering and I forget exactly my orders, but I was like, can I get a coffee and a water? And the guy sitting next to me, his head just spun around and was like, are you from Philly? And I'm like,
Woodard,
wow.
yeah.
Immediately clocked me. And he's like, oh yeah, my brother's from Philly. He sounds exactly like you. I was like, oh, that's fantastic. So
Woodard's
you'll
the big
find
one,
you'll find
yeah.
another mid-Atlantic person in any lifetime, whether you want to or not.
It's true. Even the accents are similar in terms of Baltimore and Philly. And I don't even have that much of one because I was, upper middle class prep school boy growing up in the
Yeah,
suburbs. My father
same.
had yeah,
So
had like a very thick one because he grew up in like the city, like Highland Town. And whenever we were in Florida when I was like a kid on like a vacation and somebody just like noticed it, we were at a store and they're like, you from Baltimore? And he's just like, yeah, yeah. And it's just my wife's from DC, so she'll even notice it in me if I say something. She'll be like, oh my God, like your O's. Like I'm like,
it's
okay.
the O's. It's
I don't even
always the
hear
O's.
it because like, whatever. But yeah, I love that too.
I
But
was getting French food last. I was in New York for the past 2 days for work, and I'm like was getting French food with a friend, and I'm like, "Can I get the escargot?" And I was like, "I gotta hold back on this. This is not going to work very well with that O sound." Definitely like didn't sound like that as a kid as much, but as I think just living in Philly like proper, it
yeah.
somehow just ends up seeping into your vocabulary. Or I just never noticed it because everyone else was saying their O's like that. So.
Well, that's interesting too. I mean, maybe we'll talk about this, but like the kind of obviously people talk about this on the internet all the time, with the kind of regional accents and kind of
Yeah.
social media destroying them as everybody kind of talks like they're from California now. But there's like, yeah, I don't know, something like that. Like even things like when people would move to the UK or something and they have like a weird kind of broken English accent because they're are just
Mm,
around people talking like that all the time. So you start to like say certain things in that British accent, even though you're not British, you know? Just
exactly.
yeah, just how that
You
works
absorb
out.
it.
Heavy,
Bored.
heavy,
I am heavy, heavy, heavy.
Bored.
I may say the male is entirely hostile. No!
resources,
Life, friends, is boring. We must not say so.
This is Andrew Wittstadt, and you are listening to Heavy Bored, and we're recording this on January 17th, 2026. My guest today is the author Audrey Lee. Audrey's debut work of fiction is out this month, January 2026, from Farthest Heaven, a collection of short stories titled Utter Goodness, which of course is linked below, listeners. Audrey has also penned two poetry collections and holds degrees in creative writing and American studies from Franklin and Marshall College. Audrey owns and operates a Substack page, also linked below, listeners, called Audrey's America, where Audrey posts everything from blogs to creative nonfiction to serious essays on the craft of writing fiction and more. And she's also a great Twitter follow, which is where I first encountered Audrey and her work. Audrey Lee, thank you so much for coming on Heavy Board.
Thank you so much for having me, Andrew. Appreciate it.
The first question that all artists and writers get on this podcast when they come for interviews like this is, what was your childhood like? Where did you grow up? And what did your parents do? How did these years start to form you? And I know we were talking about this a little already,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, so I grew up in the suburbs of Philly, part on the main line, part in Delaware County, Delco, as many people know it. And my family is very small and insular. I don't have many extended family members. So have my mom, my dad, my younger sister, and then on my dad's side, two or three cousins, two cousins on my mom's side. So we're all very small and we're all very close knit. My dad's an investment banker, and my mom did not work when I was growing up, but worked as an office manager once I was in high school. So I grew up I love my family dearly and I'm very close with them. But the running joke was sort of always like my family are very analytical people, working in finance. My mom always was like, I don't know where you came from because like none of us have a creative bone in our body. And then here I am. And the two main things that differentiated me from the other family members were that I am a very creative person. I'm a writer. I've always been that way. And I have blue eyes. No one else in my family has blue eyes. Besides that, we're all pretty similar. And so yeah, I grew up in the suburbs. And my family was always very like education minded. And I was always very grateful that even though my family are not creative people, that my parents were always super supportive of my writing. I think that it was something that definitely they maybe didn't understand at points, but I remember being in like middle school and I got grouped into whatever like, gifted kid program they had. And I was the only kid in the writing program. This is gonna be some like very deep Audrey lore here. And I was the only kid in that English writing program. And I was like, I want to write a novel. I was in like fifth grade. And my mom read some first draft, like this handwritten not or like that I wrote on like a legal pad. And she's like, this is hilarious. Like you should turn this into a larger project. And I wrote this novel called Welcome to Planet Earth. And which is like, it was, again, I was 10. This is like 2009. And put it up on Amazon. It's still there. Going back and reading it is really funny. I'm like outing myself here, because I definitely like, um, and to be fair, a teacher was also editing this. This went past my parents. This went past teachers. There's like several slurs and Holocaust references in it that I was just doing because that was like, I guess, what was normal at the time.
You could do it then,
Um,
yeah.
it's hilarious reading it back again. Like I had one kid calling himself retarded. I had like I remember I was reading like Diary of Anne Frank at the time, and I was like, it was a little insane. But that was my first book. It's unfortunately still available, and I'm not going to allow you to link that one in the description. But my parents were, especially after like seeing my drive and interest in this, they're always like, "This is something we'll support you in," and that meant a lot to me. I was able to go to like, I started writing and publishing my work in magazines when I was about 16, and went to some like pre-college writing programs. I got to go to the University of Iowa before college, for the Iowa Young Writers Studio, and they still supported me in getting a creative writing degree in college, which I'm sure a lot of parents would probably be like, absolutely not. What are you going to do with this? And it worked out, and I've always been, I think they've also seen that I've had some sort of drive in me, regardless of that creative streak. Not saying creative people can't be driven, but they were very supportive of it, and I that's sort of where I grew up in, is parents who were like, we don't get it, but you're doing well at it. So let's put what we can behind you for it. So, yeah, I also grew up traveling a lot. My parents, we did a lot of like, we did like Yellowstone trips. My parents had a place in Utah. So went out to Utah when I was very young, and we also saw like the national parks and like Zion and Bryce. And I think I grew up with a total sense of awe about these places. And that is what started to influence a lot of my writing. I am not a person who writes about herself, but I will take snippets from where I've been, stories and people I've met along the way, and totally fictionalize them. So I always am like, I'm not an auto fiction writer whatsoever, but like any writer,
Good,
you
yeah.
pick things up. I know, right? It was funny. I was
I have
talking
a
with
few
someone else.
questions about it. Yeah, we're gonna get to the
Yeah, I think
confessional.
exactly. And I'm so happy to talk about that more, but it's like picking up these snippets, kind of putting them in, my brain, or I have like a list on my phone of things I eventually want to incorporate into stories. And then putting them in a situation in which they probably have no original connection to whatsoever. American Girlfriend is a great example of this, actually, in Utter Goodness.
Well, I know. So basically, what you're describing is the idyllic American suburban childhood,
Yes,
which
exactly.
is what I came from, which is what almost every writer I've had on the show has come from.
Yes.
And there's all this, I think it's leftover cultural stuff from the mid 20th century. My parents didn't support like everybody in my writing programs. I went through the MFA route, all of that kind of
Mhm.
thing. There was the only ones whose parents were like, you can't do this were the Asian kids. Okay, those were
Yeah.
literally the only ones. All right. And I get it, whatever, there's cultural blah blah blah. It's like, okay. But like, yeah, like one of my best friends in the program, he was a Vietnamese refugee when he came over here, like, 40 years before he went to this program as a kid, he came over here post-Vietnam War. And then like he said the same thing. Like his parents were constantly on him, even in his like 40s, kind of just like, okay, like, you can't do this. This isn't a career. And he was just like,
Yeah.
okay, but nobody else had that. Everybody else's parents were like, oh yeah, follow your dreams, especially if you have like boomer parents, just
Yeah.
like, yeah, follow your dreams. And it's just, that's like a leftover cultural thing from like when the boomers were young and their parents wouldn't let them do that. Or like
Yeah.
their parents would tell them that like it's not a career path. And they're like, I'll show you, dad.
I think my parents too also had this like sense of trust in me, which I think turned out right, because I definitely was, it was my goal,
You earned
was
it, right? Like, yeah,
was like I was going to work still, and I
right.
was, unless writing was going to totally support me.
Which is
And like
rare. Yeah.
in like, yeah, exactly. Like every writer I know still has some sort of day job,
Right.
and that's great, because I think that's, it adds structure to your life. You get health insurance, great stuff like that. I work at my the writing's the right side brain, left side brain is I'm a pharmaceutical marketer in my day job. And I think my parents were like, we love this writing thing, we're going to support it, but you're still going to work in an office, right? And I was like, of course.
Right.
And so there's the follow your dreams thing. I think my parents were something that boomer parents maybe don't always do was the structure of it.
Right.
Um, and follow your dreams can be very hands off, go forth and do what you wish and figure it out. And my parents were not that. They were helicopter parents. They were involved in everything, and they also were like, so you're doing writing, but you're also going to, you know, have a salary. And I was like, absolutely, because I have always really liked like work. So that was one of the things too, where they were, and that's not unique to them for sure. But they were still very like, we're doing structure, we're doing
Right.
hands-on, you still have expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're going to skip the next question then because it's always like the next question is always, when did it come into your life? You said very young, right? You were writing novels very young. So then the next question after that is always, okay, well, who are the first writers that you were enamored with? And this can be anything, but your go-to idols, inspirations, people always have answers to this, but I feel like we have to ask it. Yeah, who are your
Yeah.
go-to idols, your first and like things that you couldn't put down that you were obsessed with or still obsessed with, your biggest inspirations, the authors that guided you here?
Yes, I would say I'm going to start from around like when I was like 14 in this
Please, yeah.
situation. I was a just voracious reader as a kid and pretty much picked up anything I could. But especially I think around and when I was younger, of course, like very young, like I was writing like the stuff I read, which at that point was like a lot of fantasy, a lot of sci-fi, like, excuse me, stuff that like a 12-year-old loves to read.
Oh yeah.
And I'm not a genre fiction writer at all now, but when around the time I was like 13, 14, I think, well, when I was 11, I picked up Catcher in the Rye for the first time. Didn't we all?
And was this assigned in school? Was that assigned as
No,
no? You just picked it up. So you were just
I
that
liked the
girl. Yeah.
cover in the school library, and I was like, this sounds like I'm looking over right, my bookshelf is right here. I have 6 copies of it, so I like collect them. But I started this thing where I read it like about once a year between the time I was like 10 and like 20. Which is a really good book to do that and like sort of check in with yourself once a year. And I think that was one of the first like things that I read where I was totally in love with the character and the language of it and obviously the setting, this like, prep school kid, very 20th century writing. And I read a lot of Salinger after that. And then around the time it was my freshman year in high school English class. My teacher gave us, it was like American, introduction to American literature. And he gave us A and P by John Updike to read. And so my first encounter with Updike, and that I always like point to at, it's a short story, but that is the one where I always point to as like that's the thing that I read and I was like, this is going to change my writing. Not obviously consciously at the time, but that story is again for like a quick overview for the listeners. It's this checkout grocery store checkout kid in the 60s in a beach town, and he sees these young girls come in wearing swimsuits, and it's obscene and they're asked to leave, and he's upset by this. And it was one of those stories where I was like, I loved the writing of it because it was so sort of disgusting and gross. But it was but it's like when when you see someone in like a store and you're
Yeah.
like suddenly fixated on their like worst features or something. And you never say it out loud and you would never, but you just can't stop noticing things. And um, it was just one of those things where I'm like, writing doesn't have to be very nice and like showy and inventive. It can just be gross and realistic and almost in like a perverse way. And that completely changed, especially how I think I wrote characters. And that I point to as like the short story that ended up sort of changing my trajectory, if you will, for the rest of my life. So I would, start there in high school. I'm staring over at my bookshelf here, picking things out. Like any good 17-year-old woman writer, I got into Sylvia Plath, which completely one-shotted me for the next like several years. But I was writing a lot of poetry at that time, and that was sort of I think especially someone who was doing a lot more poetry when I was younger too. something good to read, especially because I was, coming of age in that 2016, 2017, so on and so
Right.
forth. Set of writing. So you're getting your, Ocean Vuong retrospective eras. Yeah, but I would really point towards, your Salingers, your Updikes of the world. David Foster Wallace, I was given to at a very young age. My
There's a
first
type of
encounter,
girl. There's a type of girl that
yes,
really loves David Foster. I have a friend from grad school. She's been on the show. Shout out to Lee.
yeah,
She loves it. She was unapologetically like loved DFW and stuff. And it was always just like, oh, it's for dudes, it's for lit bros. It's like, no, no, like
no,
he's just good. Like
yeah,
he just did something that nobody else has done since or before. Like
exactly.
that's what he
And
did. Like, yeah.
I think the rewriting of David Foster Wallace is a lit bro man thing, which of course was totally scorned in, the
It's very
26.
political. Yeah.
It was very political and it was also just completely made up. Like David Foster Wallace was not that at all when he came out.
Right.
He was such this Gen X writer.
Right.
Everyone read him.
Feminist, even like,
Yeah, he
yeah.
was known as this, everyone loved him. And
Sensitive young man. Sensitive young man. Yeah. Like,
exactly.
yeah.
And this sort of like rewritten history of 2016 where it's this lit bro, like, he's, misogynist. I don't even think anyone called him that because no one who was saying that actually read David Foster Wallace.
Right. It
Um,
was after the Mary Carr memoir where this
yeah.
really took, and I've covered this on the show before, but yeah, it was after that memoir came out. Whatever, he's dead. We can say what we want. She can say what she wants. But it was
Mhm.
kind of, you could just tell the difference between the memoir she wrote when they were alive, when he was alive, and then the memoir she wrote when he was dead. Like that
Yeah.
first memoir, she admired. You could tell she admired and was in
Mhm.
awe of this man, his genius, this kind of thing. And then the next one was like, actually, because of this kind of political thing, I've changed my mind, and it
Yeah.
was that did kind of, and it's, I mean, obviously, I think cooler heads will prevail there, hopefully, but you never know. But yeah, okay, so DFW, Salinger, Updike, and then a Plath. Plath is one, the internet has poisoned that too, where there is
Yes.
this kind of, she was so good. And I get it. I always say she only had one book. I get it. I get it. One book of poems. I get it. But it's so good. Like it's very good.
Yeah.
But then it has there's other factors that people are talking about when they talk about I like Plath. So they're talking about her being hot. They're talking about her being this kind of depressed, I hate being a mother, hate being a woman type of thing. Although not necessarily. I think that's kind of, overdone
Yeah.
too, right? Especially if you read her. I've had other guests on that are very into it, the amateur scholars, let's say, about this kind of thing. And you say if you read her diaries, and that's not what was going on. That's not what she was
Yeah.
thinking. She loved Ted Hughes. He loved her. Like it was not so like, the movie depicts it where like there's this like tense, awful marriage. Clearly she was depressed as hell and that was a problem. But like, yeah, so there's always that. She's kind of just been romanticized to this thing that she
Oh
wasn't.
yeah.
And I get that's kind of how it works with writers, big art figures, right? You kind of get romanticized out of your control to this godlike figure. And but yeah, I mean, everybody talks about the bell jar. I thought it was one of the most boring books I've ever read in my life, but it was just, but I get why, it was a new thing publicly
Yeah.
saying that like you don't like being a mother. Like it was a
Yeah.
new, fresh, shocking, like, oh my God, like, and that's why it's remembered. I get it. But yeah, okay,
I
so
think
great stuff. I wanted to poetry, which is poetry. When I was doing this and doing the background for it, I was like, okay, so you put out two poetry collections. What drew you into poetry? Was it Plath and all those kind of confessional greats
I
in the
think
60s?
I think it was. I wrote a lot more poetry when I was younger. This is a really fun, and I've always been a fiction writer. Like that's what I started with. I've always been a storyteller. And around the time I was in high school, I started, I took like a poetry class and I started writing more poetry. And the issue with poetry for me was that I wasn't as interested, and again, I'm staring at my bookshelf here. I wasn't as interested as like in the craft side of it as much as I was in like the craft side of fiction. And so I was kind of doing whatever. And my thing about poetry, and I think especially at the time, and I don't regret writing a lot of poetry at all. Obviously, I look back on stuff I published when I was younger, and quite frankly, I'm like, okay, that was actually pretty good for what was going on. Some of it I'm like, actually go off, girl. But some of it I'm also like, oh God. And poetry is one of those things where I enjoyed writing it, and I enjoyed sort of the puzzle piece tinkering with it. And everything I wrote in a poem ended up becoming a story
Yeah.
anyways. But I have several issues with poetry. One, it's very interior. Especially when I was growing up, you had a lot. I wrote about this in a Substack essay. You might be writing about yourself too much. But in that like post 2016 era, your confessional poetry was just sort of your standard. Everyone was sort of eschewing your nature poetry. Like, why would you write that? It's boring, write about yourself. And I think poets look a lot too much to themselves.
Right.
And it becomes almost sort of this narcissistic feedback loop. And two, I think that poetry is inherently just kind of easier to write sometimes, because it can be short. I'm not saying that as a generalization, but for most poets, it's easier than a story. It's shorter. It's easier to put out in volume. And there are also a lot more poetry, like small indie publications out, despite there being no money in poetry. There's a lot more small and independent poetry publications out there. And around the time too, there was also this sort of ethos of like anyone can be a poet, which means there's also a lot of bad poetry out there. This is this great perfect storm of people writing about themselves too much, people who are being validated and they're not very good poets. And I was an okay poet, I'll say. I am not someone, and I eventually kind of came to terms with like, there are some really good poets out there. And poetry, thankfully, is still one of those things, and I think it's becoming more now where the cream will still rise to the top. And more or less, hold your thoughts.
Yeah. You
I
saw my
think
reaction. Yeah, listener.
yeah,
Yeah.
I know. I think, but I will say, just out of the, because there is so much more poetry, and again, I think of this era, a lot of it was less, it's not the meritocracy. It wasn't a lot of merit, but I also kind of came to terms with the fact where I am also not at the level of the good or better poets.
Right.
And I've also just enjoy writing fiction more. Poetry is something that I enjoyed but didn't see a future in, if you will.
Right.
And I think that's something that a lot of poets should come to terms, or a lot of writers in general should come to terms with. Just because a lot of people do something, or because, you might enjoy it doesn't mean it's your strongest suit. I'm happy that I listened to other writers' feedback at that point too. People like my poetry, but I was always just like, I always get better feedback on my stories. And when I was in college, I concentrated in fiction. And I'm really happy that I did in that, long run. And I wrote pretty much fiction entirely after college. And that's where I've just found, I think there's also a solid difference between fiction writers and poetry writers in terms of like personality and what their goal is in their writing. Fiction writers, I think, can always write more for an audience. And poets write more for themselves. And I say this as generalizations amongst between your published poets and your poetry, and then your like people who just started writing poetry and it sucks and they published in like 200 tiny sloppy lit mags. And so you have your entire spectrum there. But yeah, so this is my long rant of saying I liked poetry. I used to publish a lot more poetry. I had a poem come out today in Spectra, which that one was one that I had written a much longer version of and I tinkered with, and I've become such a fan of poetry as an exercise in like brevity and concision. But it's not something that I write constantly anymore. I'm always going to be a fiction writer, I think.
Yeah, that's one of my questions that I like to ask people that do multiple genres and stuff too,
Mhm.
with kind of because it is my background is poetry. So I got my MFA in and all
Mhm.
of that. And
Yeah,
I
sorry not to be like, oh yeah, I think
no,
you're
no, no,
actually
no.
making
I
this
think you're
career.
on. I mean, I think you're right about a lot of it. Yeah, with this, I think you were almost too generous in some of the
Yeah,
institutional side of things. Yeah, with it's weird because I'm in this weird position with starting this podcast where like I rail against the institutions, but I'm not anti-institution. Like I think
Mhm.
institutions are important, which is why I rail against the direction they're headed in, or
Yeah,
just what they hold up, what they give awards to, who they say is a great writer, and all of that matters. It
yeah,
matters in the grand scheme of things, and people pretend like it doesn't because I think that's just a cope. That's just the insecurity thing that people, oh, it doesn't matter. Yes, it does. It matters a
it
lot.
does.
especially, yeah, who gets the actual benefit. So therefore, who can actually do this for a living? That matters too. Who gets selected to do that from, prize money, the Genius grants,
Yeah.
MacArthur, Guggenheim, all these kind of grants that you can get, NEA grants. That matters, and the institutions decide who gets those. So yeah, I think you're 100% right, and I want to get to the confessional side of things as well because I have theories on that as well, and I think they align kind of perfectly with your ideas on that and your essay on that, which I'm going to bring up here. But just the idea of like approaching the two differently, because I always say this too with poets, it is this kind of very precise exercise in language where it's every little word, and not just every little word, but where it comes on the page, how it lands on the page, and that rhythm that's established through it. Even if it's not rhyming, listeners, and metered, I get it, right? But just that rhythm that's established through it, it kind of establishes its own kind of pattern to it. And like when doing that, when you have a few exercises in that, like you were talking about, fiction opens up to you in a way where it's like you have more space, you have more options, and you can take that little craft exercises of poetry, like you said, you use poetry for, and you can expand it into this much more freeing kind of form where you can kind of go all over the place. Of course, there's still structure, there's novel, there's story structure. Of course, I get that. But I was just going to ask, like, how do you approach those differently? And you do nonfiction as well. Do you approach nonfiction, fiction, and poetry differently as a writer? Do you have a different process? And the reason I ask this because I think something like this matters. It's a detail that people don't talk about that often. But I actually had a fiction. He had a book come out. That's why I came on. But he's a lawyer by day. And he was telling me that he actually had separate desks for when he did his lawyer work, during the day, and then when he did his creative. He said he couldn't even sit at the same desk
Yeah.
just because of that mental space. So that's why I was just asked that question to you. And again, Audrey, you can answer these however you want. So, like, do you approach the two differently? Do you approach the three different forms that you work in differently, or think about them differently, edit them different? I don't know, anything. Yeah. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and I'll start with like nonfiction and fiction here because I think these two I approach from a similar standpoint. And it starts with container. So usually, and I'll start with a story here. So like if I start writing a draft of like a short story, almost 100% of the time, my idea is way too big for a short story container, either in scope, in like length, in the amount of characters. It's way too big. And I end up pulling one of, so say I have a, story this big and I have a container this big, and we don't use video, so my hands right now are making a big box and then a small box. And I always end up sort of finding a good thread in that big box, some one item, and pulling it into a small box where it can fill out the space appropriately. And in writing creative nonfiction, my ideas start as way too vast as well. I'm like, I want to write about the embarrassments. Is that like why we need to be embarrassed? This is what I've been tinkering with for like what feels like months now. I started writing it after that, like as having a boyfriend embarrassing essay in Vogue. And I was like, this is too big of a scope. This is way too big of a scope for like one essay. And so I've kind of been on and off with it. But usually I never like delete those drafts. Usually something will hit, I'll find an idea and something like that and be able to pull it into the container. I started writing, you might be writing about yourself too much as like a rail against like the Substack Aniastans and, diary girlies of the world. And was like, this isn't actually the story. Where did these come from and why are people still writing this? And so that's sort of that like big idea, let's refine it into one. And I think my sentences work in the same way. I am someone who has a lot of words they want to get onto the paper. And I would say a solid 40% of them aren't necessary most of
Right.
the time. So usually when I am editing down a story or a essay, I'm editing it in the same way, which is for concision. What can how do I say the most in the least amount of words? Um, and that's, that can be very flexible too, which is good. And so sentence structure is something I really pay attention to there as well.
It's very
Um,
poetic. Very
well,
poetic. It's
here's the
that
thing.
poetic influence. Yeah.
With poetry, I edit in the same way. I start out with something that is just way too overwrought. And I'm like, how do I get this down to something that actually, like, is concise and punching? I always like writing that feels like it punches you in the gut. And that's kind of what I want to do a lot of the time. And, so in this way, like, I think a lot of my writing and editing processes are similar. For which I think I'll leave at that. I think that's a good answer. I tend to write things in a similar way. I think the subjects that I'm interested in differ a lot though. And one of the things about poetry and why I started writing a lot less of it is because I'm not interested in writing about myself as much. I can't do it. I've tried. I've
Yeah.
tried writing autofiction. I've tried, confessional poetry. And it always feels just very self-flagellating. And I kind of hit a point where I'm like, who cares? Do I care? Not really. And so that was one of those, moments where poetry became a little less interesting. And I'm not saying all confessional poetry, all interior poetry again is bad. Mine wasn't as good as I think it could have been. Um, and so with fiction and in particular, it's very easy for me to avoid writing about myself. It's just not what I'm interested in. And I think when I write about myself and my life and I get frustrated with it because I know way too much about it. And
Right.
thus I'm putting way too much down on paper and it's impossible to be concise with it. And nonfiction, it's that weird in between where a lot of times it starts with some personal anecdote. And then I'll be like, this doesn't matter at all, but what's the point of this? Let's write about that point.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm always just fascinated how that comes together and how we do it. Because I think at the end of the day, it's sentences, right? Everything is these sentences. And if you take it from that approach, well, it becomes easier to hop through these genres, right? Because then you go,
Yeah.
okay, yeah. And if you kind of take it from the sentence level. I mean, that's something I had teachers in grad school and even in undergrad that would, I always shout her out. Leslie Harrison was my big mentor in undergrad. And she would say this all the time in class. She's like, poetry is sentences. Like, that's what it is. And it would always be this, she would force us to kind of recognize the sentence level. Like, does what you're saying in this line conform with the sentence structure that you're putting on the page, And
Yeah.
it's just, and when you start thinking about that and then you go through contemporary poetry, you start seeing so many people are not doing that. And it's getting published in Poetry Magazine and all that, and the huge institutions
Yeah.
that pay people money to do this. They're propping that up. So it is kind of like, oh, it's so I agree with you 100%. Going off that too, I mean, already asked this, what got you into poetry? You said it was kind of Plath and those kind of, yeah, the girly kind of confessional writers at that time, and that makes sense. But why the short story? How did you settle on the short story, especially for this book? How did you settle on the short story form, or how do you determine between the short story, the novel, poem, nonfiction essay? Is there any determining factor, or is it just like you just follow it? You just follow the story, whatever you're feeling. How
It
do you
depends.
approach? Yeah.
I follow it. I always do have, and again, it's because like some of these stories in Utter Goodness went through so many drafts that they were in different forms. Goodbye Burger City was one that I started that initial idea of probably in 2020. And it became this full-fledged story actually where I started with this idea of the gas station in Iowa City, which was based on a real gas station. Doesn't exist anymore. It's now apartments. And so I start with that and this high school girl skipping class and this blue raspberry slight icy slushy. And
Sounds like a
I
Joy Williams. Sounds almost like a Joy Williams short
You're
story.
not the first person to say that actually, but that was an idea that I kind of kept going with for a really long time. And I tried it in different forms and then it eventually became Goodbye Burger City. Which that was, I think, a reject of a Paul Thomas Anderson like movie title at one point. Which is, kind of funny. But what was it? So like that's one of those examples of like I start with one thing, it may take years, I may tinker around with it 1,000 times and it becomes something else. So there's always a thread, like there's always that inciting thing that it starts with. And it's more just having to, pull in other elements, refine what I started with. Um, And I think short stories in particular, I spoke earlier about like the puzzle of writing poetry, where everything has to be intentional and only have so much space and every sort of word and placement matters. And it becomes this puzzle of putting in and fitting pieces and pulling away. And short story writing in that way is similar to me, where if I have an idea, that first idea is rarely the pieces that fit together.
Right.
And a lot of times, like I keep lists of sort of these ideas, and I always keep my drafts that didn't work out because I'll find pieces between them and pull them into one
Right.
short story. That was one where, yeah, I think Goodbye Burger City is an example of that. The Swans is also an example of that, where there was this great article in Philly Mag about this athletic club up in Bucks County called Newtown Athletic Club, and which is what the athletic club in the Swans is based off of. I think it's what the MAC. And I was like, I love this like gaudy, weird. They're swingers. It's hedonistic, like very much something I would write about. And one of the things was like when I was going through California on that train trip, I, encountered a lot of these beautiful bronzed, like completely overwrought plastic surgery types and that vapidness. It doesn't always exist as much in Pennsylvania. And it sort of took that athletic club setting and amped it up to the next level. And so it's things like this where I was working with this idea of this gaudy athletic club forever, and then was able to merge it into these travels in California. And it's these pieces, these threads that eventually I really want to put together. It's sort of like a big puzzle.
Yeah, I said it's almost like the short story is like the poetry of prose writing, right? With this
Yes.
kind of the meticulous, the details. Again, I always say this too, and I mean, I know you know this and many listeners know this, but some people still need to hear it where there's this like restrictions aren't a bad thing when you're
Hmm.
going off into the ether of creativity, like where there's no guardrails. So something like the form itself, so like the short story form or the poetry form or the novel form or yeah, the nonfiction, the 10,000 word essay or something like that is a structure that you can harness all of these crazy shit flying around your head, picking pieces and structuring it into like the scaffolding. And everyone's like, oh no, that's not how I like to create. It's okay. Well, then you're probably not creating coherent pieces of art if you're not doing it in some way like that. But yeah, absolutely. Shifting a little bit towards the cultural here, Audrey, I have a few questions about the literary culture, particularly with the alt lit scene. And I say that in
Yeah.
air quotes. One of the questions I thought might be interesting to ask you is why is the alt lit scene right wing coded, or is it right wing coded?
I think this is actually something I think about quite a bit because there's a lot of different sides to this. And I've mentioned this on like a podcast before. There was this great essay, I think it was in the Drift, about what makes alt lit. I'll send it to you so if you want to link
Is
it
this
to
the Chris essay, the Sam Chris essay
possibly.
that went viral about how it's not all that alternative?
Yeah, it's not transgressive and
Right.
it's not yes, exactly. Where it's like, what is actually alt about this outside of like, something like my first book by Honor Levy using this very hyper of the moment internet speak
Right.
language, or Fuck Boy by Sean Thorcon Rowe. I always mix up if it's Thorcon Rowe or Conroe yada. And like where it's just like this is using this very internet speak language. What is actually transgressive about this? What makes this very alt? And is it because it appeals to this hyper online sort of avant-garde reader? And excuse me, I slipped my eye, edit that out. Give me 1 second here. I
Yeah, no
don't know what
worries.
just got into my eye, but something did. Um,
Yeah, women love getting shit in their eyes. Yeah.
yeah, I don't know what just happened or where it's coming from,
No, yeah,
but
my wife does it all the time, and she's there's something in my eye. I'm like, how did that happen? We
what
were
is it
just
always
sitting here
that
on the
way?
couch. So
Yeah.
yeah, but
Okay, we're back. That hurt. That was weird. Um,
you can take break
but
if you need a break or anything. Yeah, we
no,
can
we're
bathroom
fine.
breaks, anything. Yeah, I know it's going for like 2 hours is,
No
bathroom breaks,
worries.
drink refills. Yeah,
I got enough water still. I might need to a little bit, but I'm like I have my like weird, internet esoteric health electrolyte drops in here
Oh,
for
okay. Yeah,
today.
that's right. I have a few questions about that coming up as well once we get
Yes.
through the alt lit. Yeah.
Let's get through the outlet. So back and we're rolling. And I think that alt-lit can, and for the most part, be right-wing coded because what it does do is it goes against this very identity and self-driven narrative writing that has dominated literature for, I would say, most of the 21st century.
Yeah.
And in this case, I talk about your like identity politics driven writing which I never was just interested in, even when I went to a liberal arts college, I came of age in that first 2016 round of stuff. And it was just always not one, I wasn't going to be writing stuff like that.
Right.
It was just, again, very self-flagellating. I didn't see a purpose in it. And I think that a lot of people felt the same as me, whether we spoke about it or not. And I think that, and how do I want to word this? Alt lit is like inherently against that. I
Right.
rarely read something alt lit that is like so, even the auto fiction stuff, it's never necessarily about like, the self and the victimization of the self. It still rejects that by having this very like detached meta irony quality to it. It's like you're writing about yourself through someone else's eyes. And thus it avoids that extremely earnest interiority, which I think just became, again, the gold standard of the 21st century writing.
Yeah.
And whether it was actually good writing or not, mostly because it was the whole very like diverse narratives thing. And I think now the issue here at hand is I don't think a lot of the alt lit has a lot of merit to it either.
Yeah, I agree.
Especially
I agree. Yeah, yeah.
so it's not always the like best alternative to what it was
Right.
because we still have to be very hypercritical of this writing and be like, is this actually good writing? There
Right.
was plenty good of that era too, but not much. And most of what I thought was good was not always the stuff that, again, that cream that rose to the top. And I think that alt lit is because it rejects that leftist sort of like, again, ID pole, like,
Which
writing,
is the mainstream. It's the
which is the
mainstream
mainstream.
institutions, the publishing houses, the
Exactly. It,
magazines. You see it on every page if you read any
yes.
magazine in this. Yeah.
That is what makes it alt in that
Right.
it's not that. And so it's not that's something that I don't think the Sam Kress essay answered. It's alt because it's not that mainstream
Right.
voice and narrative. It's something else that frankly existed, and I keep pointing at my
Right.
it existed in that 20th century, your David Foster Wallace's, your Jonathan Franzen's at the beginning of the 2000s. Like when people wrote for the purpose of writing and for the purpose of creating that art and for the purpose of inventing worlds in their stories that maybe were just that didn't always have to be some reflection of the current or tapped in. And I think that that's what this group of alt lit, that's what we like to read and that's what we like to write about. At least I do. And that's what makes it alt is that it's nothing to do with what has been coming out for the vast majority of mainstream publishing. So,
Yeah, I think you're 100% spot on. It's always this, I clarify this to people, although I seem to be doing it a lot. My problem with the alt lit scene is the same problem I have with the mainstream lit scene, is
yeah.
that it's kind of bad. Like it's kind
Yeah.
of not good. And I love the energy. I love the idea. I love the rebelliousness that's kind of inherent in being the alternative lit scene. But I'm always just like, oh, whenever I read something from it, I'm just like, oh my. I mean, there are exceptions, obviously, but I'm just most of the time I read something from it, I'm just like, I wish this was so much better than it actually is. Like,
Yeah.
it's actually not that good at all.
My thing is that I
Like,
think the vast majority of alt-lit writers, we have a lot of alt-lit writers. We need more alt-lit editors. We need people who are not afraid to take a bright red pen to a page and tell these writers, myself included, a lot of the time. I have worked with some fabulous editors who, when rain me, literally have to rein me in like a
right.
lasso. And I think that more writers need to, we've got a lot of good writers, and I think alt-lit has a lot of potential. We need some alt-lit editors who are not afraid to just absolutely cross out half of a book basically.
Right.
We need that. We need to be reined in. And that is what is going to make our rating better. I think we're in sort of also one of the things that I didn't really like about, again, this, I keep saying 2016 to now era, but you know what I'm
It's
talking about,
important.
these,
Yeah, that's a
the
very
TDS of the
distinct
world.
cultural moment.
And
Yeah.
I think that we were way too like nice about bad writing, obviously. We're in this crisis of literary critique, where a lot of it is we're not being mean enough. People I like love to point to like the old Pitchfork reviews of albums that were just utterly scathing,
Right.
or like old literary reviews, and we haven't had that for a really long time. And I think that I think we're coming back with that, thank goodness. I think Bookform and LIRB publish, and a lot of these more independent, like Washington Review of Books, publish some really good literary critique. But for the vast majority of this time, like you can't critique something because, you know, a woman wrote it or whatever. That's a lot of what you might be writing about yourself too much is about. And I think it's led to just this acceptance of like just lower quality,
Yeah.
sloppy writing. And we need to bring back editors who are willing to be mean to, you know, writers. And we need a lot harsher literary critique. And yeah, I say this as a writer who can fully be critiqued in that same way. And because that is, I think, provides that guardrail. You know, we're all creative people. We love to be a little avant-garde and go a little crazy with it, but we need someone to put those guardrails in place. So that is something that I think alt-lit could really benefit from and improve its merit.
Yeah, and I mean, you pointed out, you mean we keep pointing out that 2016 cultural shift. It's people want to dismiss that. It is so distinct and it's so
Yeah.
important to what happened over the last decade here. Like I was in grad school at the time, so you could see it in real time. I was in an MFA program. So, I mean, imagine that happening with this kind of huge cultural shift, shifting from everybody thinking like DFW or stuff like DFW was like the pinnacle, like the greatest thing you could do. It's kind of transgressive, it's kind of funny, it's kind of cool, and all of this stuff. And then all of a sudden it wasn't allowed anymore. There is this, at least not allowed in the mainstream. Of course, you can do this independently. You can do it through the alt-lit publication, all of that. Like, of course, I'm not saying it doesn't exist. That's why I get so that's why I always am talking about the institutions because it's what
Yeah.
is supporting that. Like, you know, you don't make money in any of these things. So you need institutional support. So what are they supporting? You know, like they're supporting this very mediocre, if not outright terrible stuff for political reasons. And I always, oh, I mean, just going to conferences in this field, it's so eye-opening. People that don't go to these conferences, like just look at the panels. They give you that little sheet of all the panels and when they're meeting and you just look at it, like it is an eye roll. And then when you actually sit in on some of these panels that you think might be good, like they're not saying anything. Like it's just this constant political thing that they're pretending is literary, but it isn't. And
Mhm.
I get there's some overlap because politics and culture, but I think that you're getting at this really big cultural thing. There's so many different things happening right now, and they're conflated. There's an economic crisis when it comes to publishing and books and all of that and stuff like that, publishing magazines, New Yorker and things like that. There's that level of it. Then there's the authority crisis that we're having, where nobody wants to be the authority on literature or something. And if you do that, you know, you're kind of doing some type of white thing or whatever, white patriarchy thing. If you have authority over literature or you know what's good or not, you trust your instincts, that is now suspicious. That's a cultural problem with the authority. And then we have the cultural issue, which is like politics tying into everything here. And that's just three of the things that I think that we could like isolate out, but they're always being conflated in
Yeah.
critiques, in articles, in Twitter posts. I mean, it's just constantly being conflated with these things. I remember when I went on this podcast, and it was a podcast that maybe wasn't in this weird little scene that we find ourselves in, Audrey. You know, it's a little bit more mainstream, and it was poetry, whatever. They saw my stuff, they liked it. He asked me on. And one of the things it was right when that Ian Fleming stuff was happening with the cutting out certain words in the James Bond novels.
Hmm.
And I was saying something about that, and he immediately defaulted to this kind of economic argument. And I was just like, okay, what part of the economic argument is where like we need to spend more money to censor this by according to like current day political sensitivities? Like we're spending more money to put this out than we did previously with not editing it at all. So they're
Yeah.
paying 20 somethings in the low five figures to censor these books, and you're telling me it's an economic model that like, oh, that's going to sell more? Like
Yeah.
where's the evidence of that? So it's like this conflation of the cultural problem into the economic problem. Like, no, those, while they're conflated all the time, there's two real crises happening at the same time here, which is like
Yeah.
they can't make money. Well, that makes a big problem. So you can't take risks. You can't put money behind a new writer or something like that. Like that kind of changes things. Social media has come into it. That's part of a crisis too. How you market and advertise these things has shifted drastically in just the last 10 years. And now, even beyond that, in the last 2 years, it's pay to play. So now, if you're
Yeah.
going to be on social media, you have to pay for reach. And I don't care if you're just on Twitter or something, Instagram, Facebook, you have to pay for reach now. It's too valuable. The free kind of social media age is over. That's a part of it too. But yeah, it's just so crazy how all these things are happening at the same time, and we're always trying to look for a reason or why. Because it's people like us, we just want good books. We just want to talk
Yes.
about good books and good poems and read them and critique them and think about them and then try to contribute our own. There's just this, and it just that has become harder too, because now you have to bat down all these other different crises. So you can make a literary point, and then all of a sudden you make a literary point, you have to now bat down political arguments, political points that are getting shoved into the point you made. That's a really, I know it's hard to kind of understand. I always think of the people that maybe aren't so online. I really kind of the baby boomers and a lot of Gen X, the people that are older in higher positions in these industries, they don't quite understand what's happening here because everything shifted right under their feet. And they're still thinking that it's, 2001 and what's going on? Right? It's like, oh, we're struggling right now. I'm like, no, it's so much bigger than that. And we really don't have an answer. So I just
Yeah.
always ask, yeah, like I was just curious your thoughts on, yeah, alt-lit scene, where it fits in, and to all of this crap that's going on. Yeah.
I will say too with the meta, this sort of meta irony voice of like alt lit, I think it's a lot more honest than a lot
Mm,
of the stuff that's come out in the past 10 years or 15 years. I'm just gonna say 21st century. It's kind of been this,
yeah.
you go from that very 90s globalist, we are the world narrative to whatever we have now. And
Yeah.
okay, that backfired. And now everyone and now the we are the world is just the left of like this one side. And I highly critique that. And I also think that like it's th this stuff will obviously speak for itself in 50, 60, whatever years. And I am especially against this sort of historical, but both obviously the historical revisionist of like editing old movies to make them
Right.
politically correct or editing out words in James Bond. Um, I am very against that, and both because it's not even just like blocking out the history of this art in this writing as the artist or writer intended it. It's completely changing the history
Yeah,
of
it's
it.
it's worse. It's correcting the
Yes,
history.
it's
Yeah.
it's
We're gonna
correcting it.
fix it. Yeah.
And I'm happy that a lot of people were against this, like, and that I think we'll have a bigger retrospective on it later. Of course, people will say like it didn't even happen, and it absolutely happened. And I think another thing too is the current, and a lot of this is just because of this current day politics, being retroactively applied to different work of the time. And
Right.
I think it's so easy for some random anonymous, very loud and barky Twitter account to say this is racist, sexist, misogynistic, whatever, on some art that came out 100, 200, whatever years ago.
And there's incentive for that. There's
And
incentive,
there is.
institutional incentive. If you do
And
that, if you write a big essay for that, you will get grants, you will get job
yeah.
offers, you will get positions of power and prestige,
And
bigger
obviously,
microphone to, bigger perch to say your piece from. Yeah.
so it's easier for the institution, the publishing house, the university, whatever, to correct that versus having any sort of integrity to
Right.
the past and honor to the person who created this in the past. And also that item as a historical art, if you really want to look at it from like a more like, I guess, left point of view, still like you're still destroying this sort of integrity and historical hit this history and what that meant in the context at the time. It's getting completely erased, and I just am totally against that. I'm someone who that is looking back at and I'll pull like people love to talk about like the Odyssey and the various historic translations of it, and the Emily
Mhm.
Wilson one being the most recent.
It's a big
And
online, big, big, big
I know.
Online controversy. I say online because that's where it
It
lives.
is.
Yeah.
It's exactly. It's entirely online, but
Uh,
like looking at how that book is translated and has been over time is just, it's detrimental to that
yeah.
history of it. And yeah, so I am very much like these are ephemeral pieces. These are first excuse me, what I'm like what am I looking for? Secondary versus like primary text, or it's a primary
Yeah.
text. And if you change that history, you change the rest of it moving forward. And that's obviously not right. So, yeah, that was sort of my rant on that as well. And there's a lot of, as you said, incentives for institutions to uphold this. And it's been very detrimental overall. I don't think I need to say that,
No,
but yeah,
yeah. I mean, I was talking to a mutual of ours, Brad Kelly. Shout out to Brad
yeah,
Kelly. Go listen to that episode, listeners, on his show, Method and Madness, where we were talking about how literature is in a weird place because it has both of these political elements. So it has these kind of the liberal, kind of progressive, freedom. Everybody has a voice, democracy, this kind of very left-leaning principle, kind of embedded in the fabric of creativity and art in general. But then there's also this kind of, he called it a small c conservative. And I was like, yeah, conserving historical texts, conserving primary source. Like there is this kind of conservation conservative angle to it as well.
yeah,
And we're only focusing on the progressive part of it right now, and that is killing the kind of,
yeah.
the duty, especially in academia, where that is part of your duty if you're a tenured professor in literature to preserve the text and then to discover new texts. So I get it, but we're only doing the kind of let's discover new texts and retcon the canon, all of that kind of stuff. It really complicates things, and it's why nobody can even have a straight conversation about this kind of stuff, depending on who
I
I'm talking to. If I bring it up, even, like they'll be like, what are you? I'm like, oh, okay, we can't talk about that. The reality that's happening right now. It's complicated. It's not so clear cut, but yeah, but it keeps being forced in this left-right divide.
yeah.
That just, yeah. I mean, I think you're spot on about it. Yeah.
I think too, like I went to, as I said, I started college in 2017. And I went to a small liberal arts college and I was a creative writing major and American studies major. And I am someone who is now going back and reading like I think would be like a great books
Right.
sort of canon right now. And these sort of again, what are the great books? And um, how do I want to word this? Like, but at the time, and this again is that historical revisionist thing with David Foster Wallace as a lit bro thing versus a good writer or like I think that at that time too, there was this decolonize your syllabus
That's a huge
movement.
part of it.
And
Yeah.
a lot of stuff that I think should have been taught, the great books, and this is just my opinion, had been for a while at this point probably wiped from
Oh, yes.
the sort of syllabus because it was a white man writing it, or it was just an old text. What relevancy does it have? All those points. And thus, I mean, I enter my freshman year and I'm taking classes on like feminist writers in Latin America versus like American literature. It
Right.
immediately sort of skips those intros and goes full force into these niche topics. And I don't think that was very good for whether or not you want to, teach these niche topics or not. I think you still have to give students a basis in American literature or British literature, and then you can or even South American literature, and then you can extrapolate into these niches. And that is something that, when you're taking these books out of your classrooms, when you're degrading your 20th century fiction writers that, your David Foster Wallace's, your Salingers, so on and so forth, you're completely changing the narrative, retroactively completely changing that school of American literature and that history of American literature or just literature in general in real
Yeah.
time. And I think it was detrimental for my education. I did get a great education. I am very grateful for it, but I really do think that, that was also a mistake in hindsight. Writing should be taught because it's good, not because of the writer.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, you're touching on this is a theme on the podcast since it's existed.
yeah.
As part of the reasons I started it is this is I went through undergrad and then grad school studying poetry, basically. That was my emphasis for both of those. And the number of things that are just omitted from the Western canon when you're doing
Hmm.
that, I mean, I say this as it's kind of a joke, but it isn't because you can do this. You can get a PhD in literature now without having read anything before 1960. And that's
Hmm.
fine. You could be an expert in late 20th century poetry or something. That's fine. But if everybody's doing that, like if that's all everybody is doing, well, then we're losing everything. Like
Yeah.
when I was in grad school, the big thing was they're getting rid of medievalists. So any medieval
Yeah.
specialists are just getting dumped from universities. They just don't have a position for that anymore. So we're going to lose that. Like that's going to be lost. And of course, places like Harvard will always have like one medievalist on staff or something. But like all the state schools, all the local schools, all the smaller schools that aren't these Ivy League giants, right? They won't. So you just don't have
Mhm.
medieval studies with these kind of things anymore. That's huge. That's a huge detriment, especially if you're trying to be a writer. And I part of the podcast, I mean, we go over stuff that I think was omitted from the canon here, where I'm almost not like angry, but I'm always just like, why wasn't I taught this? Like, why didn't we go over
Yeah.
this with an instructor when I was 24, and getting obsessed with this stuff? Like, why did we just skip over it?
Hmm.
And even like stuff like that, like the amount of time you spend on like the Harlem Renaissance and stuff, and some of that stuff is good, but a lot of it is just political crap. Like it's just not that good. It doesn't
Yeah.
hold up. This isn't even my words. I've covered this on the podcast, listeners. You could go listen to Carl Phillips has said this before. Put it into print, and then has since reneged all of that because he wouldn't be able to have his tenured position if he didn't. Uh, it just constantly this things that we're destroying it almost by not even realizing that we're doing it too,
Mhm.
which is the most frustrating part. And also, I think one of the most naive and dangerous parts about it too, where we're
Yeah.
we're losing something that made literature great. And I would say it was never about the person, right? Like I get there's all this political stuff and we can talk about that, but it's like it was always about there are pieces that are better than others, and you know it when you read it. You know it immediately when you see it. It's just something there. You feel it when you're reading it. Like, and it's just, and people say, oh, it's subjective. It's not so subjective. It's pretty fucking
Yeah.
objective. Which ones are great works of literature and which ones are
And which ones?
mediocre? Yeah,
Yeah.
like, or just, okay, it's okay. But then there's ones that are like, wow, like, yeah, that one, oh, that was 500 years ago by Shakespeare. Like, oh, okay. Like, it's great. There is
Yeah.
nobody else that has done that. Like, it's great.
And you
And
don't need to, you can still have your very, again, your niche topics, your 20th century,
right.
21st century poets. You can teach that. You can't, you can't put it in as a placeholder for your medievalists or for your, the start of your Western canon in your great books. You can have both, but you can't have one replace, that latter replace the former.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's going to keep coming up, Audrey, because what's a theme on
Yeah.
the podcast, and it's just I think it's just so important to literature right now. Another kind of cultural question that I wanted to ask, and more personal, is I wanted to ask, all right, the tin fish, the esoteric health stuff. I was like, what? How did you get into that? And also, why is that right wing coded now all of a sudden?
Oh
Yeah.
boy. I wow, let me think for a second. So,
You were just
because
psyoped into it from the timeline, right?
I
Like it
know
was.
I literally did, but I'm better for it, which is good. I was, in college, coming out of college. Okay, yeah, you drink, you're partying. So does everyone else. You're fine. I never had like a problem, sort of. A lot of people like when I talk about like not drinking, they're like, so like what happened? And I'm
Oh, you
like,
don't drink?
I don't drink. Yeah, no, I don't drink. I'm
Are you
completely,
are you completely sober? You don't do anything?
yeah, I don't do drugs either.
Caffeine?
I have way too much caffeine.
Caffeine.
That replaced yeah, no illicit drugs. I will occasionally have a Zyn as a treat. And because I do like those. But I it was funny when I stopped drinking, I sort of realized that like every person who goes sober always sort of has to fill that with some sort of other like weird semi like dangerous isn't the right word, but for me it was drinking way too much caffeine. For Mormons right now it seems to be the Benson Boone backflipping and like gymnastics. What else? People get really into like liquid death. I got really into running. That was one thing too. You still
Yeah.
got to feel something, but instead
Right.
of,
That
a bottle
endorphin
of wine,
release. Yeah.
it's running a half marathon.
Yeah.
So it'll still dehydrate you and make you feel hungover. That being said, I think that a lot of the reason, so I am obviously very into that esoteric health side of the internet, and I think and I think that comes from like a very biohacker, techie side of things that's been around for a lot longer too. Um, and I really like it because it's one fun to kind of just run weird experiments on yourself that really just generally don't have a downside. And it's a good way to find different things that work for you. I have, my health is something that I take very seriously. And it's also this sort of like like this, what's the word I want to look for here? Like a exponential line where when you try one thing and you're like, I feel great, let's try some others, you just sort of get the ball rolling and you keep
Right.
it up, you feel better and better and better, and so on and so forth. I remember when I was in my first job out of college, I was like, if I was really hungover or something, I'd have Pedialyte. And I'm like, this makes me feel amazing. And then I had one of those like recess sodas, it's like magnesium or something. And I was like, this also makes me feel amazing. Kind of putting the two and two together, I'm like, it's the magnesium. And so I started taking magnesium supplements, and I'm like, I feel great, love magnesium. And sort of from there, figured out what worked for me through this trial and error biohacky protocol system. For me, that's meant a lot of omega-3s. This is where the tinned fish comes, excuse me, from fish oil, obviously a lot of cardio and exercise, lymphatic system drainage. So for me, like hot yoga and dry brushing, all these weird things. I love having the things that like objectively work and are like scientifically proven to work. And then the things that are so woo-woo that you're like, this makes me feel good, not sure what it's doing, but
Right.
I will keep doing that. And I think it's a very like right-wing coded because for a couple of reasons. Um, One, because I think, a little too much, there's just way too much leniency on the left. There isn't a lot of like discipline. And it can be a very hedonistic, anything goes, anyone
Right.
can do anything sort of, which understand to an extent. It's a very actually libertarian view in a way. And I'm like, do what you want with your body. But it's gonna be your fault, basically, if you F up. And of course, that lack of personal responsibility also is sort of lacking on the left. And I think that taking control of your body and taking your personal responsibility for what you put into it and what you do with it, and also having the discipline to do that, those three things are much more right coded because it's not something that a lot of the left wants to do. It's funny because there was obviously this shift between like the very anti-vaxxer, raw milk types, used to be very crunchy left
So
type.
SoCal, Southern
So
California.
hot.
Yeah.
So literally the entirety of Southern California. And obviously it was very this hippie coded thing. And that was also a very like anti-government thing as well. Like the government's poisoning us. Fluoride in your water was a very like
Right.
left thing. And now it's totally shifted. I think it also has to do with that like control and the lefts now shift to like very pro-government, and though they're the experts versus like the right is definitely more in that like let me have that control of myself. This again another very in this like libertarian horseshoe of on one side, on the left you can do what you want, you can be anything, it's okay if you're unhealthy or whatever. And then on the right side it's like you can do whatever you want. You can drink raw milk. You can do weird, like all this stuff. Don't take your vaccines, so on and so forth. And big medicine, big pharma, whatever. It's funny because I'm very pro, like, very, I would say like Maha coded, but I work in pharmaceutical marketing. So don't tell my employer I said that, I guess. But I at this, so it's again, it totally becomes this horseshoe. And it's just a sign of the times of where that narrative is and what the sides lean towards. But I think it is certainly right coded right now because it's this like your self-control, your discipline, your emphasis on personal responsibility, I think is the big one. And also that sort of like anti-government rejection as well.
It's interesting because I'm fascinated by that, the thing we keep talking about, that 2016
Yeah.
cultural shift, where there is this kind of, because it's so important, and I get it, people talk about it all the time online, but it's still just understudied in these institutions, understudied in like the policy institutions especially. But it's just this kind of,
Hmm.
yeah, it's so crazy how these hippie things, like I was just like the things that you listed off, even when I was asking about, like, yeah, you kind of, whatever, the quirky health stuff, the esoteric health stuff, they could have all been left-wing coded 5 years ago, even 6 years,
Yeah.
10 years ago. I mean, it was all left-wing coded, and now all of a sudden it's right-wing coded. I always think it's even, I mean, Occam's razor kind of explanation. It's even simpler than that, right? It's just an anti-Trump thing. It's one of the things I
Yeah.
see in finance a lot as well. If I could have a hobbyist when it comes to finance and investing and whatever, blah, blah, blah. Most people, the audience, this doesn't care. But it's just like when I see things like that too, there's a huge sentiment issue. Whereas if the economy is doing well, but because Trump is president, you cannot admit that publicly, and you have to constantly
Yeah.
go on MSNBC or CNBC and just be like, or Fox Business, and just be like, oh, everything's bad, the market's going to crash, like it's going to crash. Like it's kind of this thing where it's just, it's an anti-Trump sentiment. And researchers in the finance field, probably because they don't give a shit about politics, they just care about making money. So like they're
Yeah.
like, they've noticed this, where they poll people, where they ask, if you, depends how you ask the question, depends who is president at the time. Like it really is this kind of,
Yeah.
not to oversimplify, but it really is kind of a TDS, like a Trump derangement syndrome effect that has kind of just rippled through the culture at every level and every institution and every little thing. And then even like the RFK stuff, right? Like all the things that you said, like people are going to accuse you of being some shill, right? They're going to accuse you of being some quack.
Yeah.
Regardless, and again, some things that RFK Jr. says is, you can verifiably, it's verifiably false, some of the things that are
Yes.
said. And then, but then some of the things he said are verifiably true as
Yeah.
well. So it's like, but people don't make that distinction, right? Like the
No.
fluoride in the water thing, most people don't even really notice or care. It's just an anti-Trump thing to be like pro fluoride in the water or whatever. I've even seen like breakdowns of this where somebody talk about how, like, fluoride in the water is kind of a leftover thing from like before we had, fluoride in all of our toothpastes and mouthwashes and things. So like, people are getting enough now. But, in the 1940s and 50s, kids were having like all the kinds of problems with their teeth or whatever. So because like the nutrition was bad, the water was poisoned, whatever it was, like it's just kind of a leftover relic, and we probably could get rid
Yeah.
of it with no consequences whatsoever, considering everybody kind of brushes their teeth with fluoride toothpaste. Although, are you anti-fluoride entirely? Are you off that
I'm
like
not
old
anti-fluoride
Tom's?
and I'm not anti-fluoride entirely. I use fluoride toothpaste to go to the
Right,
dentist,
right, yeah.
yada yada yada.
Crest is
But
easier than the whatever fucking naturally stuff.
I do
Yeah.
use fluoride toothpaste, but I use some weird natural thing called Hello
Of
that doesn't have
course.
SLS, sodium lauryl sulfate, in it because that's a neurotoxin. No, I am this person. It's so,
Yeah.
but because my thing too is I can talk about fluoride all day, whatever. But I think my problem, like that's an example of like I think people didn't like fluoride because they were like, this is something you're putting
Right.
in the water against our will, which is what I understand.
Right.
And now that, 40 years later, there's a study done that over this time, fluoride had a negative effect on
Right.
like the IQ of the children who grew up
Right.
drinking it their entire lives. So there isn't this purpose for it anymore now that, as you also said, people now like brush their
Right.
teeth and have dental,
Yes.
go to the dentist.
And the water is like
Um,
clean, like we're not like doing it in a
yeah.
river or like pulling it out of a well
You're not
with a
getting like an
bucket.
amoeba in your nose because of it. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And again, like there's nuance to things, and there's an absolute utter lack of nuance in any sort of discourse today. You're either all on one side or all on the other, and it's like I totally agree. I am not like an anti-vaxxer type. But my nuance to that is like, I get I've gotten what I know I need, and I don't get what I don't think I necessarily need to be healthy. And that's what you have as a freedom to put in your body. And that is one entirely other thing. And people are like, I've gotten asked like, oh, why do you follow RFK on Instagram? Do you like agree with him? And I'm like, well, not with everything,
Right.
but for the most part of things. And it's been so funny reading this, they came out with that new food pyramid, which is like so good. And it's like, that's completely correct, but somehow there's still people who are finding some
Right.
twisted way to be like, this is bad and fascist, actually. And it's like, no, you actually just need to eat like real food. And that is something where yeah, exactly. You can't say they're doing anything good. And if you suggest even some sort of nuance of that, like, hey, I don't like this, but I do like this, it's just you're off the map. So,
Yeah, and it's always the reason I bring it up, and the reason I want to make that comparison is because just think about like especially Obama, like Michelle Obama in the first term, like the first lady's kind of cultural pet project that they do. She was all about like let's move, right? That
School
was her
lunches.
thing. The school lunches, eating more fruit and veggies, putting the vegetable garden in the way, like all of these things. And then it's so similar to what RFK says, but for some reason, because of this TDS thing, because of this thing with Trump, like it is this kind of unmentionable thing. Everybody treats the stuff, especially like there's probably a lot of overlap between this Michelle Obama stuff and the RFK stuff. Obviously, RFK has a little more power than the first lady does
Yeah.
in situations like this, so that's what people get upset about. But I'm just like, if you compare them, they're on the same track. Like they're on the same.
Yeah.
You think Michelle Obama doesn't do some weird serum like in her coffee, or like you think that's not like what's happening? Like, of course it is. She's a billionaire. Like,
Yeah.
of course, and of course she's obsessed with what food she eats. I mean, she's in her 50s, looking great, whatever. Like that's hard to do. Not everybody gets to do
Yeah.
that unless you're rich and have leisure time and can afford the supplements, whatever, GLP-1s, all
Exactly.
that stuff. But it just that because I think that's an example of something in health, but that also follows through to the literature towards everything that's happening culture right now is this kind of that's the divide is this stupid political thing that everybody just puts all their wagers on it. They just bet everything on this, and it's really detrimental to not just literature, but I think even things like this, like discovering health innovations or nutrition things. Like it's hurting that research now. So
Yeah.
now instead of like even the vaccine stuff, there's a few things that just are not being grappled with, where there are a few
Yeah.
instances, and granted, it's probably pretty rare. Everything shows that it's pretty rare. So, okay, probably less than 1% chance this happens to you, like having some, detrimental effect from the heavy metals or whatever that are in these vaccines. But then people just deny that there's anything there, and that
Yeah.
gets people very upset, makes them double down. And it's like, no, the health institutions need to acknowledge that there is like, a 1% chance or less of adverse reaction, and it wouldn't be such a huge deal. Most people would probably still do the schedule, but like it just because it's this political thing, it is blown up out of
With
proportion, out of context, out of everything. And then again, that kind of overlapping problems start using as excuses or to explain it away or define it away. And it's just part of the times we live in that you can't escape it. Like that's what pisses me off more than
now.
anything is you can't escape it online. You can't escape it in literature. You can't escape it in like any type of like endeavor you're trying to do. If you're going into fucking medicine, well, now it's all about this like kind of political leanings instead of the studies that are showing you the data and all of that.
I think that
Yeah,
basically, if there's some narrative being pushed that this is 100% good, 100% safe, 100% of the time, it is probably not true.
right.
There are no 100%s.
Especially in
And
medicine. I mean, yeah,
especially
it's
in
medicine.
medicine,
Yeah.
not all of our bodies work the same. That is not a controversial
And
thing
it's
to say. It's just
and it's also
logic.
like what do you want 100%? Like it's like 100% is
Yeah.
going to be impossible to achieve. There's always going to be like a 1% variance or something that's good. Like it's
Yeah.
never going to be, it's going to be 95, 96. Okay, well that we've historically that was always good enough. Like we would
Yeah.
say like historically because especially when we're talking about mass pharmaceutical interventions like the whole population taking like a vaccine or something, it's
Yeah.
even, I mean, and people, because of that too, like, well, my daughter is 1.5 right now. We were doing the
Mhm.
vaccine schedule. We were doing the Dr. Bob Sears schedule, which is kind of like a spaced out. It's still on schedule for everything,
Yeah.
but he's no more than two at a time, and you space them out throughout the first year of life. And we've had zero reaction. She barely even had a fever during most, because okay, she wasn't getting 6 shots at once. Okay. We were
Yeah.
giving one or two and then spacing it out, and there was nothing, of course. So we're taking that 1% risk of an adverse reaction and lowering it even further by spreading them out. Like, that's fine. But like even doing that, like going to the doctor's appointments, like all the nurses, everybody's just, oh, like you're doing that. It's just like,
Oh, you're
yeah,
one of
it's this weird
those.
kind of thing. And then all these assumptions are put on top of it, mostly political, how you voted, how you do all like this is all
Yeah.
just like part of this bigger problem where politics is too involved in everything and people are playing too much on their teams. And I get that's kind of a easy critique. I get it, right? We're polarized, right? People been saying that for a decade. But it is it is the problem. Like it is the major problem with
Yeah.
everything. Like we can't even fucking talk about literature without people hearing something we said during this conversation and then going down a checklist of politically correct or even just assigning to your party. Like I'm sure you even get this, oh, you're not right wing enough if you don't do
Yeah.
even more of this tin fish shit or something, like this kind of thing. Like it just that's where we are, and it's destroying the culture. It's not just
Yeah.
destroying art and literature and politics, it's destroying everything.
It's a very
Uh,
totalitarian way of looking at the world, and that's something I utterly hate. I started writing this essay, I haven't finished it all, about how on, the left right now, the dominant narrative, whether, this is realized by most people on the left or not, is the Marxist narrative of oppressor
yes.
oppressed. And that obviously was extrapolated from your bourgeoisie, extracting surplus value, whatever, from your proletariat, you're oppressed, to what was it, the pedagogy of the oppressed? I forget exactly who wrote that, extrapolating it to obviously race and gender and teachers and students and parents and children. Everyone is oppressed by an oppressor of some kind. And because of that, the very totalitarian narrative now is that the oppressed is the victim and can't have that personal responsibility or claim fault. And that obviously leaves I don't like inflexible ideology narratives. I don't like that. And that's when you get also, you're like 100%, you're totalitarian. Um,
Anti-art. It's an
it's
anti-artist stand.
anti-art,
Yeah.
it's anti-truth, it's anti-science. This also obviously happens in, like, as we were talking about, in medicine and in health, and I think, and that's just a narrative I don't work with. Joan Didion, who I obviously love. I don't like style my own writing off of her, but she is one of my favorite writers. Um,
Towering figure in
just
the literary canon. Yeah, towering figure in
exactly.
the 20th
And
century. Yeah,
her essay in the White Album, The Woman's Movement, is one of my favorite like essays of all time. And it basically gets to the, like, once you're past that sort of first two waves of feminism. So now you've had your suffragette movement, now you've had, like, your woman in the workplace. Once we've basically reached the necessary equality for woman, you still get that the woman's movement of like radical feminism and how do I want to word it? But basically her still being like, the woman is still trying to be a victim here.
right.
We've achieved basically everything that we need to. And it's just an inflexible ideology where if you're always going to be oppressed, like if the man is always going to be the oppressor, you're never going to be satisfied. You're never going to be happy. And it's basically a lot of wasted air. And that was an essay that was extremely formative to like my beliefs on, again, I am a woman and I
Right.
completely believe, I'm not of that crazy right-wing ilk that's like, women shouldn't vote or all that. Like,
Right.
women should have agency. Like, I am not of that, but I don't think that means that women are exempt from critique. I don't think that means that women are constantly the oppressed. I think that, she also had a lot of frustrations with this extremely
Yeah.
inflexible narrative. And that is in this inflexible ideology. And that is something that has obviously, made me be like, this isn't true. This is not totalitarian. Life is not a totalitarian thing in
Right.
America. And we have freedom, we have liberty, we have freedom of speech. You can do whatever you want with your body, and most of the narratives that are not true that go against that. And I think that that's something that is very anti-art as well, as you mentioned. That has been the dominating narrative for the past 21st century, especially since 2016, in terms of what comes out in mainstream writing and literature and art, movies and music and everything else. And yeah, and I guess you go back to our alt-lit conversation where
Right.
alt-lit doesn't discuss that. It's not part of that project. And with health too, that also means, hey, if I don't want to, give my child six vaccines full of heavy metals at once that they maybe don't even need, like, oh, you're bad because you're not, you're somehow that makes you the oppressor. And you're not listening to the experts who are suddenly now some kind of victim of your personal choice. And
Right.
that is also, on the left-right spectrum, like when you talk about health and you talk about how discipline and personal responsibility and control over your own body becomes right-wing coded, that's because on the left, everything becomes the fault of someone else and you don't have that personal responsibility. So you are a victim to, like, your how do I even want to word this? Like, if you choose to not exercise and eat horribly, you can blame that on something else that's not yourself. And then, say like I'm actually oppressed because people are like fat phobic or something. I don't
Right.
know. And that is just not how I function, and that's not what I believe in. And I think that that left oppressor oppressed ideology is exactly what, both your extreme progressivism and your mainstream Democrats have taken on now. And it's not how the world works. And it's caused a lot of detriment and frustration. And yeah,
I was gonna
I've
ask
ran.
if I mean I was gonna ask if you're familiar with Red Scare, but I mean you're a Tin Fish
Oh
girl, so
God.
of course you're familiar with Red Scare.
Yes,
I just this
I
thing Anna Khachiyan said years ago that I've never forgotten, where she kind of was talking about that, where she said it's this very weird dynamic because it's women demanding to be a protected class. And there's reasons for that, of course, right? Especially
yeah.
historically. So they're demanding for that, these kind of exceptions and protections by the law, but then also a demand to be totally equal in like every
Mhm.
way. And he said it's kind of like you're never going to get both because those are two complete opposites, right? If you want to have a protected class status in the law and in hiring, blah, 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 all these things we could point to. It's a contradiction in terms of also wanting that. And that's where the big kind of everybody's bumping up against it because we
Yeah.
just can't get over those two factors there because they're incompatible in terms of achieving what is the stated goal supposedly. And it's just interesting to, yeah, if you think about it that way, I'm like, huh, she was dead on with that, where it is this kind of it's hard to have both. And then of
Yeah.
course there's all this, okay, equality doesn't mean parity. Okay, okay, I get it. Yeah. All of those things, and I get that too. Yeah, there's and I want to get to all this. Are you good on time? I know we're going
I'm
long,
good
but I'm
on time
loving
still.
it.
I know we've
Yeah.
been talking for a while, but
But
I'm good on
I'm
time.
loving
And
it.
I want to
Yeah.
talk about the book and stuff too,
Yeah,
obviously.
yeah. I know, and we just keep going off. I have to go to the bathroom real quick too.
Go
Yeah,
forth, take a break.
yeah.
I can get some
Please.
water.
Yeah, a couple minutes. You just leave everything running. I'll be back in like 2 minutes.
Sounds good. I'm
Uh,
gonna get some water.
but okay, yeah, I wanted to ask you about Substack because
Yes.
Substack, I wanted to ask just kind of basic questions. And again, we don't need definitive answers here, but it's just, is Substack the future for writing and writers? Is it where writers are going to build audiences going forward? Your experiences with Substack, and I know a lot of people listening probably have done this as well, where it's just, yeah, how do you view Substack as it kind of goes, it
Yeah.
grows and grows as it's growing throughout here?
I think Substack is a platform that to be fair, I think it's done. It's been very successful so far. One, because it's actually given there haven't been many ways for writers, besides books, of course, to even in like as long as the internet's been around to have this like completely structured, like almost patron system of people paying to access writing. And something that I was surprised about when I started, excuse me. Something I was surprised about when I started doing like paid subs is that people actually do want to pay for your
Yeah,
writing. And I don't think that there's been that sort, your other system for the, since now that we're past the era of the patron, if you will, in the, 20th century and before that. And in that meantime, been the way to make money as a writer has been to publish your writing and sell articles to magazines and books to publishers, so on and so forth. And now Substack gives writers another way to make that money. And a lot of people have been very, very successful at it who may have not been who maybe not gotten a book published otherwise. And I think now moving forward, obviously there are a lot of not great writers on Substack. That's what you get for just having an open platform.
right.
And none of those sort of like gatekeepy editor, not gatekeepy is not the right word, but like having the wall of an editor up against you. And it's some way too, I think Substack's a great example of this free economy, the free market economy, where it's like if you like a writer and a lot of people like a writer and they want to subscribe and pay for their writing, those are the writers who are going to be successful. And if you're a bad writer and people don't find value in your writing, they're not going to subscribe. It's supply and demand. So if you have a good product, you will make money. And somehow this didn't work on platforms like Medium, for example. This Substack is not the first obviously blogging platform that offers a paywall option.
Right.
So I don't really know what made Substack different, if you will. I think when it started out, it was almost a prestige thing. Substack got a lot of really good writers. I remember I was at the New Yorker Festival a couple of years ago, and Mary Gateskill talked about writing on Substack, and she's like, "Well, they paid me a lot of money to be on
Right.
Substack paid me a lot of money just, but it worked for Substack because." They see their Joyce Carol Oates and writers see their Joyce Carol Oates and their Mary Gateskill and so on who are on Substack, and they're like, I can be on there too. That's not
Right.
something that other blogging platforms did before Substack. So that being all said, moving forwards, I think because Substack is as I said, great example of how supply and demand and like a choice economy can work. Like,
Right.
I think it will continue to work. If I, and I'm also, I don't know what another platform that writers might migrate to. Um, Twitter tried this article thing. It hasn't really functioned in the same way. And I think that it will keep being a net good for, even if it does,
Right.
even if it can be a net bad for writing, just because it doesn't have that sort of editorial, perspective, not perspective, just like element to it. I think that Substack will keep working because readers who want to pay for writing will keep paying for writing that they want to read. And Substack is set up in a way that really incentivizes that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm thinking you might be a little too young for when they call it the height, the golden age of blogging, right?
Yes.
This is where yeah, Andrew Sullivan, Glenn Greenwald, all of these big, political commentators now, they all started blogging in like the early 2000s, and then it like came to what it is now. And then Substack, maybe it was just the right time when it came around in
Mhm.
the digital age, like the media landscape with social media. In those early days with the Glenn Greenwalds and stuff, it wasn't quite what it is now, and it just maybe it was just the right place, right time. And then they had a really good recruiter who I know was offering people like six figures and stuff to be like, hey, we need
Yeah.
big writers on this platform. And it was kind of at that time. I know Andrew Sullivan has said this publicly, where like he was getting articles pulled from New York Magazine because he
Yeah.
were too right wing or something. And he is a center right, gay, HIV positive,
Yeah.
like Catholic boy from England or whatever, and is a very mild conservative in terms of like what you would hear nowadays, at least. But he's
Yeah.
around that 2020 George Floyd like riots. He was that, and he's like, okay, I'm going to go independent. They offered him money. I think Matt Taibbi was the same thing when he left Rolling
Yeah.
Stone. He got offered like a six figure for 1 year at least. Hey, post on our site instead of your, working for Rolling Stone, and like,
Yeah.
you get to keep
Barry
everything.
Weiss was
Barry
another example
Weiss.
of this. And obviously the free
Yeah.
press is still completely run on I don't, I eventually it might have shifted over after the CBS acquisition,
Right.
but
Right.
it ran on Substack's framework
Yeah.
forever. So,
And she was recruiting the hell out of people. She got Douglas Murray to write things for her,
yeah.
and then she was getting what's his face, that humorous New Yorker guy, the guy who wears
Uh,
skirts, and
don't remember his
you
name.
know who I'm talking about though. Yeah, he's like the
Yeah.
humorist or whatever that writes.
Is it David Sedaris?
Yes, David Sedaris.
Yes.
David Sedaris. Yes, that's who it is. Yeah. So recently during post 2020, he's been wearing like skirts and stuff to like interviews,
Interesting.
and I'm just like, okay, dude, like, yeah, all right. But
Go
yeah,
go off, like, but yeah, I think
yeah.
it's wild, but I go off, I guess.
And this is also leading Substack and social media as we get to your specific Substack articles. But I wanted to ask, using social media, and this is a question I ask a lot of writers and artists that come on, social media's role in a writer or artist's life and career now, its place in terms of marketing, just, like the attention economy, how do you use social media as a writer, and how do you see yourself, using that? And like,
Yeah, I am very conflicted by this all the time. I used to use social media a lot. Believe it or not, given how online I am on Twitter, I used to use social media a lot more than I do now. I was a huge Instagram girly, especially back in like, when I think before like Reels took over. I used TikTok during like the pandemic, and now I pretty much use Twitter exclusively. I still have an Instagram, and I will because it's good to stay like connected with more, Twitter. I obviously am much more like I don't know everyone IRL. And not a lot of like people I know IRL are on Twitter, versus like everyone's on Instagram. So Instagram, I keep it. I don't have it. I didn't have it downloaded forever, and I would just check it like in my browser. And now I have it downloaded to promote the book. But Twitter, it's also kind of funny because whenever anyone asks, like, oh, do you have Instagram? Do you have, whatever social media? I'm like, so I have Twitter. And that gets some reactions like, oh
Hmm.
yeah, I don't use any of these other things except for X.com. And
It's the most addictive, I think.
it
It's
is,
one of
it
the most
is.
addictive ones. And they're all
I've
addictive,
broken
but yeah.
broken the Instagram addiction. I've broken the Twitter, or no, definitely not Twitter, the TikTok addiction, but I will not willingly break the Twitter addiction. But with that being said, social media is sort of this weird dual thing for me where it's like I have never leaned. Social media depends right now a lot on your brand, I think,
Yeah.
and what people know you for. And I have a lot of things going on in my life. It's funny because some people know me as like the train girl on Twitter. Some people know me as the tin fish girl on Twitter. Obviously, a lot of people know me as the writing girl on Twitter. And it's sort of like juggling those things. And like you go on Instagram, and a lot of influencers, they have like one thing, that's their thing. Like, I'm gonna be a esoteric health content creator. I'm gonna be a like West Village girl, day in my life creator. Like you have to have your one brand. And I am someone that has never taken social media seriously enough to like adhere to that. Because of that, I balance a lot, like, myself posting just anything, versus like posting about the book, or my writing. I think I strike a good balance that is very authentic in a way, because if I just posted about like writing, and then it would become way too LinkedIn-y almost. And that's not the purpose of Twitter for me. Like,
Right.
Twitter is for personalities. If I wanted to just be like a writing all the time, I would go on LinkedIn or Instagram and whatever. But so social media is a tool, especially as someone who has grown up in the social media era. I went through the 2015 Tumblr thing. I've been on Instagram for a while. Obviously Twitter, I think I've been on now for like since 2014. So this will be year 12. That's actually terrifying. But I think that, where was I going with this? Social media is obviously a good tool. You can't, and one of the things too, and why I keep Instagram like downloaded and for the purpose of like promoting a book, is that you can, rail against all you want about social media. But there really isn't a situation where you can be like an artist or a writer and be totally offline and expect people to,
Know who
either
you are at all.
know who
Yeah.
you are and like take you seriously, sort of a thing. Maybe if you're like a Thomas Pynchon of the world, of course you can do that.
Yeah.
But as an Audrey Lee, like, I'm not going to delete Instagram on principle and then be like, oh no, no one's connecting with my book, because that would just be stupid. Like, that's not how, you can do that, but you can't expect people to have the same sort of like either reach the same amount of people, or have that same sort of like lasting like image with people, I guess. One of the, when I was started to post about utter goodness and like the cover, I'm just like, post away, astroturf everyone's timeline with utter goodness. And yeah, you have to shake a level of shame, obviously. Sometimes I'm like, man, I'm posting way too much about the book. People are probably getting annoyed. And I'm like, well, that's one more person I reach,
Right.
every time I post it. And, people want to unfollow me because I post so much about my book, so be it, whatever, have fun. But I think because, I'm also someone who is still like bring back shame, and like has some sense of like not insecurity, but just like, I don't know what the word is here, but not wanting to, I don't want to feel like shame about, or for people to be like, oh, don't like this girl, she posts way too much. So I think that you have to like push aside your shame and push aside your embarrassment, and post through it is my best advice, I guess, or like take on it. So, it's not just a tool. Social media is sort of an absolute. You can't drive a car without an engine, if you will. You
Right.
can't really promote your art without a Twitter or an Instagram or whatever. Um, and I also, but at the same time, I'm really bad at having like doing my one thing in my brand. But in a way, I think that's been successful for me. I definitely have a personality and can be an online personality. And people tend to like the balance between, posting about the writing and posting about the book and craft and stuff versus me. What did I post at like midnight last night? Pronouncing shadow ban like Autobahn. Like, off the cusp, bits like that. So
Something that's I think about, I want to ask you about is especially for female writers,
yeah,
do you have to kind of do this e-girl thing to market even? I wonder because I see a lot of people fall into it, of course, and then if maybe
yeah,
somebody just whatever, I understand the appeal of it. I understand why it's happening, of course. Like there's yeah, I mean now especially you can get paid for it. Getting views on your pictures and things like that. But I just, I don't know. Do you think that's like a trap that female writers especially are kind of getting caught in where you have to, to promote your book, you have to post a picture of your book in like a bikini or something. I don't know. I mean,
yeah,
something like this where you have to kind of do this e-girl kind of thing to market your writing,
yeah.
right? I mean, I don't
I
know. I mean, I've asked this of other like female, younger female writers that have come on here with that because it is. I mean, obviously there's an advantage to that, right? I mean,
yeah,
you'll get way more views than if like a
for
man
sure.
did that like a male writer or something. Yeah. So it's just, I don't know. I mean, and I've heard people say that all social media is inherently female coded because it's kind of like works in that way, in the socializing way, the gossiping kind of way. And then you said brand building too. So I wonder, yeah, I mean, there's always been that thing where sex appeal helps for the brand. Even something like Joan Didion or something. There was definitely like a
Yeah,
sex appeal. Sylvia Plath, Saxton, like these kind of big figures. I don't know. I don't know. Do you think that's a
yeah.
thing that's happening, or is that something that like many female writers can get caught up in, like almost like a trap, or like because then you're kind of known for being like hot instead of known for your work. I mean, I don't know. Does that even
Yeah.
bother people? I mean, is that oh too bad? Oh, they think I'm hot instead of my oh too bad, right? I mean, I don't know.
My,
Yeah, I know it's a weird way to ask it, but
I wouldn't call it a trap necessarily. I mean, once again, everyone has like personal responsibility and free agency over how they want to present themselves online. Not touting myself here. One of my things, like obviously I post pictures of my face and stuff and like outfits I'm wearing, but and I like self-awaredly joke, oh, I'm an e-girl, like just because I'm a woman posting online about like my life. I also have a thing where I'm like, I don't post anything that I wouldn't want like my mom or my grandmother or my employer to like really see or read. And I'm also not someone who's like, I'm not comfortable posting my body like as much in like a bikini in a way. So it's not just something I do. But at the same time, I obviously might get some more attention and sell some more books if I
right,
did that. And I am not someone who is like, oh, obviously I'm like anti like OnlyFans, porn, all that, but sex is always going to sell
right, yeah,
no matter what. It's not, there's no sort of situation in the world where that is going to stop. Um, because this can go on for I can go into some whole history of this, of course, but um, I think that women who want to, sell their writing or whatever that way, again, you have free agency, you can. I don't see it as like a trap necessarily for that reason. One of the things about utter goodness in particular, and I spoke about this with Emily Sapora on Victim Radio, is that there was this, again, very e-girly marketing thing, I think, around like the just post pandemic era of this like disaffected woman narrative. So you're my year of rest and relaxations of the world, your Substack Anais Nin types, who definitely like it was this very girlhood, almost like virgin suicides aesthetic sort of way of marketing your book. Like I'm pretty and I'm hot, but I'm also sad and I'm a writer. So it was the glamorous like philosopher sort of a thing. That's a great
I'm
tweet.
Sylvia Plath, yeah,
I'm Sylvia Plath. And in a way, I eat that up. I love it. I'm
yeah,
like, go girl. It obviously worked well for that whole like era of writing in particular. Your literary it girl types. And I am not someone who's above that necessarily. One of the things that was utter goodness is not that book. I never wrote that sort of narrative, and I never was. And when I spoke with like Will, my editor at Farthest Heaven, about marketing the book, we were pretty adamant, like, this is not that type of book, so we're not going to market it in that way. And I was totally fine with that. I mean, hey, if I want to go, post a hot picture of myself with it, I absolutely will. I might still, who knows? But there was also a good post, I forget who did it a while ago, about like how women do this on Substack as well, where it's like again, you have that glamorous philosopher type and the like header photo for their like Substack essay will be a really hot photo of themselves. Which obviously garners a lot of clicks from both women. You know, a lot of people see this as like a very male gaze thing, but young women who have, I guess, are attracted to that. Like, hey, I want to read this hot girl who like is thoughtful and writes, like, is
Right.
also very appealing to women. And so I don't think it's people do it a lot, this like very e-girl thing. I don't see it as like a trap. It's certainly a proven, tried, tr tested, and proven way of working and marketing your book or
Right.
your writing or whatever you're making. Um, and I obviously have thoughts, you know, like one of my things is like if you're someone who does that and you post sort of this sexualized content about yourself, you obviously can't then be like, but why is everyone being sexualizing me? That's just something, that's not how this works. You just have to expect that some people are gonna like sexualize you or be weird about it. And you can't just do that whole like, stop doing that. Like, that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. And so yeah, I'm not against it. It obviously works in a different timeline. I could be doing that, but it's, you know, I'm gonna post my weird food plates of like soup. And people seem to like that too, and it works with that's built me some kind of brand, which is nice. So I'll take it. I mean, I love to post a selfie when I actually take one. It's funny, I actually tend to get more like followers from like my cooking posts and my Substack posts than I do my selfies, which might say something about me, and I don't really care to look into it that further. But you know, I think that sort of marketing has also died down. It used to be like this very one brand, and I think people have sort of just seen that as a side thing now, I
People
guess. I
kind
don't
of see through it. Yeah,
know. You
there's
can
like
see through
a
it now.
suspicion about, yeah, especially artists
Mm.
doing that. But yeah, I think you're right. I was just curious because it is just like it's not again, it's not a new dynamic, but it is this kind of like, yeah, anybody can do it. And I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, Getting finally to your Substack, you wrote a piece on your Substack called "You Might Be Writing About Yourself Too Much," which is, we've talked about already, has been mentioned. And it's about this sort of this never-ending confessional movement we've been stuck in for decades now. And I always make this claim that the confessional movement never ended. It just
Yeah.
kind of started in the 60s with this group of poets, really late, like late 50s into the 60s, and then it's been the dominant mode of writing ever since. Even somebody like the FW, there's a little bit of a confessional, especially with just nonfiction stuff. A supposedly fun thing or whatever, those kind of things. But you make the claim in the essay that confessional writing has almost become synonymous with woman writer, and I'm saying that in air quotes, listeners. But I just want to ask you, what do you mean by that? How did confessional writing become synonymous with quote, woman writer? Why is What do you mean by that? And why is confessional writing so associated with, again, I'm going to use air quotes, female energy?
There's going to be a lot to unpack here, I
Yeah, yeah,
think.
please.
I think because it became sort of the when women were writing and getting attention for their writing, and this, as you said, starts in the 60s. And one of my favorite books is Culture of Narcissism by Christopher Lasch, which
It's very,
I
very Red Scare coded. Yeah.
Oh gosh, they did like that was one of the things like when I first started listening to Red Scare, I was like, I should read this book, and I was like, this is probably what I'm going to end up basing, drawing on a lot from here on out. This is in like 2019, I think I read it for the first time.
So I've got
My
Revolt
copy.
of the Elite up here somewhere. Yeah.
But my thing, and actually I have flashes, what is it? I'm staring at it right now, but I actually can't see it. This is one about woman, and that's like I just finished reading a Bolaño book. That's what I'm gonna read next. This being said, that book tracks the shift in American culture, which started in the 60s, me generation, from this Protestant values of like work hard, having your nuclear family, having your insular and close-knit community. This usually meant like your church or your town, and you living an external life sort of in service to your family and your community, towards that more narcissistic me in internal thought, like what about me? And this is where you get your therapy and a lot more therapy culture, which is obviously extrapolated. There's a lot of selfishness in relationships that started with this. I think this is where a lot of gender wars stuff started too. is a focus more on the self and the pleasing the self as sort of this highest form of like self-actualization.
Right.
And I think that confessional writing has a lot of incentives to it. And especially around like again this 20 and there's a notable shift between like the essays of Joan Didion, so to say, and like the confessional writing of the internet era. And a couple things that the internet, I think it's inherently an internet thing that caused this. Um, People love to be seen and be related to. There's this, people are so much more likely to like a piece of art or feel as if they feel represented or feel seen or relate to it. They're going to have a stronger emotional connection with it. And at the time that a lot of confessional writing started, and I'll get to the woman thing in a bit, is when a lot of print publications were going online because print just wasn't as popular and we're trying to make money off of that. And that was garnered by clicks and ad views. And that meant that obviously things that get clicks tend to be things that people like to read. And the sort of the lower common denominator of this was relatable content. And women in particular, I think, were very incentivized for writing this confessional, vulnerable writing, for several reasons. And I think one, because, um, where do I want to get at here? Like you got a lot of sort of clout for it. Going from even like the 2010s Kat Marnell's of about which was the difference between like I think the era of like 2010 Kat Marnell who's writing an essay about her like doing a whole bunch of Adderall at a party and then like crashing out is that she held some sort of like and this was bad and like this was my fault and it's embarrassing but here I am. There's this embarrassment level of it. And then shifting into the post 2016, where, you could get a lot of clout for writing about like being, a very feminist essay, or here's my experience with like, sexism or so on and so forth. That's something that was seen as, quote, powerful because it was against, it was a little TDS thing. Like we're going against the, narrative of the patriarchy and Trump, and that got clicked. So it's content like that, in short, like this very vulnerable confessional work was seen as relatable. It got clicks, and it just spawned the careers of a lot of women writers.
How much of it do you think was, I mean, everybody does this when they start out writing, right? You want to
Yeah.
be your idol. How much of it do you think is a lot of women writers, or writers that happen to be women, wanting to be Sylvia Plath or something? Like how much of it is like that kind of?
I don't
I
even
mean,
know
it's
if it
hard to
was.
say. It's hard, yeah.
Yeah, I don't even know if it was them wanting to be like another figure like that because I don't. Sylvia Plath wasn't really doing this. Like she wrote about her depression, but it was in an entirely different way than what this confessional writing was. I don't think of Sylvia Plath as a confessional writer. I think of her as someone who objectively writes. She writes about depression and she writes about, without it being necessarily, she writes about like mental illness and without it necessarily being, I'm writing about myself. She's obviously writing about her experience was with it, but it's less about herself and more about the experience of having depression or the experience of feeling like, do I want to be a mother? And that is not what the confessional writers of this confessional writing era did. It was very interior, and I write about this in the essay. It's a lot about appeasing the self versus appeasing the audience or actually discussing the larger topic that you're like talking about. And I think that look to inwards is not something that Sylvia Plath, for example, did as much. So I think it's hard to say to me. Obviously, people wanted to sort of have this, and this is what Substack. I talk about that glamorous philosopher thing. It was a great tweet where it's like a lot of you want to be like a glamorous philosopher type, where it's like you're combining how you present yourself and your aesthetics. Again, this could be a very eager argument here with like having thoughts. And that's something that because of the internet, more modern writers are, do versus Sylvia obviously didn't. So I think, what do I want to get at here? I think that's a hard question to answer
Yeah.
because people want to, the thing is though with Sylvia though, she has this sort of retroactive image to her. It's this broken woman who is very honest and beautiful and yada yada. And people want to have that image.
Yeah.
Even if it wasn't objectively what
And
Sylvia
like
wrote about.
60, 70 years of romanticizing that on top of
Yeah.
it. Like, yeah, that you can't avoid, yeah, how that
Yeah.
plays out.
So I think that confessional writing, and one of my main argument about confessional writing again, and a lot of critics of that essay that I wrote were like, well, you can't tell a woman that they can't write about, their vulnerable personal experiences. And I'm like, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that generally it hasn't been good for women's writing because you can't, it was hard to critique. If anyone sort of critiqued a vulnerable piece of writing that somehow connected to a larger social justice thing, they got called misogynistic.
Right.
Some of it was very misogynist, and a lot of it wasn't. And because of that fear of being labeled as misogynist, that we didn't get a lot of honest critique about this writing. I think overall it's made women's writing not as good as it could be in the long run. Um, and I think that obviously you can write a vulnerable essay, but you have to understand that like the critique you might get is not inherently misogynistic. And people shouldn't fear to critique bad writing because of that. You're sort of hiding bad. A lot of this was putting bad writing and calling it good because it discussed like feminism or abortion or rape or whatever controversial topic du jour. Woman, I think, got to obviously do this more because of, again, this oppressor oppressed thing. It's not like a man could go on and do this at the same time. So,
Yeah. It's always interesting with that too, like how it evolved to this thing too. Yeah, but I think you're 100% right. And then the article is linked below as well, listeners, on Audrey Substack. But it's like there's this level of if you criticized it, right, for the writing, it was always, and like I said, you make a literary argument or a literary critique, and now it's all of a sudden you have to contend with political arguments coming
mhm.
your way, even though it's not what you were talking about at all. I'm thinking of even, you familiar with Maggie Smith, the poet, who,
Yeah.
yeah, because she's gone viral a bunch of times, and it made her career when she went viral in
Mhm.
2016. And since then, she's done these really kind of sappy, kind of poor me personal essays about her divorce, about her like
Yeah.
things like this. And it is kind of cringy, like at a certain level. And then if you criticize it, you're like, oh, well, you're criticizing women or something in this way, or you think women can't write. I don't know. I mean, that's just, it goes to what we talked about earlier, where everything's kind of conflated now
Yeah.
with politics. But I was just when I read that essay and I was preparing for this, I was like, oh, that's a very interesting critique in terms of how the failure to critique from a literary perspective has actually hurt women writers in the long run, which is an interesting argument, right? And obviously, you're going to get a lot of shit for making that argument. Yeah,
I
about
did. I
yeah,
got a
yeah,
lot of
yeah,
shit for it. But I stand by it. I am
yeah.
someone who doesn't like back down from that. And
Because
you know,
it's a good point because it's a
yeah.
real point. Like yeah, like don't yeah let
I think
idiots
from
tell you
like
not.
another perspective of this, like Ocean Vuong, obviously, he's
Hmm.
posted up so much as gay Vietnamese immigrant writer, poet, and won a bunch of awards. And Ocean Vuong is a good poet, but and obviously, I'm not a huge fan of it, but everyone, won a bunch of awards for like On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. And I'm happy we're having this retrospective of, or we did it sort of over the summer of like, is this actually good? Because it's
Right.
not. I remember reading On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous and being like, I don't think this is that like exemplary.
I
I,
remember reading Night
you know,
Sky with Exit Wounds and
yeah,
thinking the
and
same thing. And this was when I was
yeah,
in grad school and I wasn't public facing yet. I didn't have the show or anything. And I got
yeah,
eviscerated just in classrooms for
exactly.
saying that, like just saying like it's kind of mediocre. Like, there's some gems in there, but like
Yeah.
this is the book everyone's saying is so great. Like I read it, I'm like, okay, like
Okay.
it's not
Yeah.
not without its merits, but it's still like this is the best we've got right now about this issue,
Yeah.
like or whatever. This
And
like
I
20
think,
something kid is
yeah.
writing these like emo confessional things.
And I think that that what you at that time you could not critique that because
Yeah,
you would get called homophobic, racist, xenophobic,
yeah,
whatever. And because it's so identity based, and that's what happened with women's writing as well. I'm happy again that we're finally having these retrospectives of like, was this actually good? And let's take some honest critique to the literary quality of it versus the identity quality of it.
yeah. I wonder if it's that we're almost living through like what you said, where like the cream is rising to the top despite all of this. It just takes a little bit
Yeah.
longer. We have to live through this like decade plus of this obsessive political metrics that determine whether something's good as opposed to the literary metrics or something like that, which I always argue are much more objective than people want to pretend.
Yeah.
Because
No,
if
exactly.
you're like, oh, it's so subjective, it kind of isn't though. Like the best
No.
ones are not subjective at all.
I always
Uh,
divide when I talk about books that I like. I am very conscious of like subjective versus objective critique. There are books that I think are objectively fantastic books that I subjectively don't really love.
right.
Stoner by John Williams being one of these. I love John Williams. I love Butcher's Crossing and Augustus. I don't love Stoner. But I think Stoner is still an objectively good book. And it's funny going back and it was totally over marketed in like the when it first was published again by New York Review of Books in like 2006, and New York Times was like, this is the best novel you've never read. And this is a writer's writer. And then there was again like a retrospective years later, and people were like, well, actually, he's misogynistic. And it's like,
Yeah,
oh God, here we go. You can't like John Williams because he's a misog, which I don't think he is,
right.
any more than any other man and when he was writing was, and so on and so forth. It's hard for me to take other sort of the subjective opinion seriously
Yeah.
when you want something to be objectively critiqued as good or not from a literary standpoint, whether or not you on a personal level agree with or like what is in that book.
Yeah, I always ran into this in grad school too, and I mean publicly now as I put myself out there with this show. Like, I mean, I'm a big John Berryman fan, particularly the Dream
Yeah.
songs. I mean, the show's called Heavy Board, and just remember in grad school, people would, it was when that was happening, where everyone was trying to call John Berryman a racist or whatever. And I was just remember being like, the only argument I need for this is no, he isn't.
Yeah.
This guy was a liberal professor at the University of Minnesota, and you're going to sit here and say, oh, he wrote this because no, he didn't. No, he didn't. This was the
Yeah.
fucking 60s. Are you kidding me?
Like, are
Like,
you kidding
no,
me? Did
no,
you
it
expect this
wasn't.
guy to be a rad femme? Like,
But even so,
that
like, that's
doesn't,
just not what it was happening here. He wasn't doing it like to be because of the black scent in, the
hmm
dream songs or whatever. I was like, he's doing it for a beauty. This is beautiful sound, language, a beautiful English. Like it makes the poems more interesting because of it, and he knew exactly why it would, and that's why it
Yeah.
happened. It was not because he was doing some large cultural thing about like how racist he is or whatever. So
Larry
it's just an
O'Connor.
unfair criticism. Yeah, it's an unfair criticism. It's not coming from a place of literary merit or anything like that. It's coming from this current day political trend, and it's a tragedy. I
Yeah.
wanted to read
Absolutely.
a quote because you have this thing I want to add, choice feminist, and you wrote this on your Substack. I am not of the belief that critiquing women's writing is inherently misogynistic, as many women writers pass it off as. Writers cannot give into an egalitarian sentiment that all writing is, at the least, worthwhile and at the most extreme. At the most extreme, valid. Women writers cannot give into the sentiment just because the writer is a fellow woman. I absolve my guilt from being such a hater by reminding myself that we need better writing and better standards for, quote, good writing. Some may call me a choice feminist. I just wanted to ask you, what is a choice feminist?
Choice feminism is this, and a lot of like very modern feminists will rail against it, where it's like you can't choose. You just, again, when I talk about like totalitarian narratives, it's like you have to support woman 100% of the time. And being a choice feminist means that you can be you don't totally support woman or you're not a real feminist because you choose what you want to like support woman in basically. And I don't really consider, I obviously I don't really consider myself a feminist as much because I believe that feminism is an inflexible ideology. And there's a lot of nuance to this. I obviously am, that being said, I think that I shouldn't support all women's writing because they're women, and that would make to some people make me a choice feminist. because I don't think that, I think that writing should be worthwhile. People should consider their audiences, and people should focus on producing writing of literary merit and value that isn't just like, valid because someone says it is or because you're a woman. And that goes for any sort of identity class. And people might say that I'm, choice feminists, or whatever, like the people who rail against choice feminists, which basically just means that you have some nuance to your thought and you don't think that women should be supported in
Right.
everything just because they're a woman. They're the types that look at like, oh God, who's Eileen something, I don't remember her name, but like
Miles?
no, no, she was like a prostitute who murdered a bunch of
Oh,
men who
no,
look at her
no
and see her
idea.
as like this is a like extreme example, but who might look at her and be like she's actually the victim.
Right.
And she can be a victim, women can obviously be victims of like drugs and trauma and stuff, but also that doesn't excuse her for killing a bunch of men. And I think that, that extreme of woman can't be at fault because they're the oppressed, that just doesn't make sense. And that's where that term, choice feminist is mostly used as a like, it's not something I identify as, but it's mostly used as like a derogatory label by like a more rad femme crowd.
Yeah, it's interesting how that's become a thing now. That's become a
Yeah,
thing.
yeah. If
Uh,
you're not all one, you're not anything at all, is like the narrative. So.
yeah, I was gonna add, going off of that too, like are women writers not held to the same standard as male writers because of that? Do you think, or do you see that, or is that what sparked it,
I think it
or
depends.
just a lot
I think,
of overpraise for mediocre stuff that just, you saw and you're like, oh, what is this? I don't know. I
yeah,
mean, what?
I
Yeah.
think it's hard to say because it depends on the one, it depends on what the woman's writing. Although I do think that women in nonfiction have gotten a lot less critique than men over the past several years. I think fiction is hard because it depends on what the writing's about again. And this is hard to say. I think women definitely have had it easier on critique. I also just don't think men have gotten published as much. And also it depends, hey, is reviewing a man's book in the past several years, is it going to come with an asterisk that like, this book doesn't discuss, isn't, representative or diverse or whatever. I think that a lot of stuff has gotten unfairly critiqued because it doesn't have those like again social justice-y themes. And a lot of work, both men's and women's in the past several years has been asked like, so why does this matter if it doesn't include these? Why are it's
Right.
that narrative of like, well, oh God, what was that essay in like I think it was the New York Times where someone was like, well, why should I even care about the new Thomas Pynchon book because it doesn't
Uh,
talk about Trump and immigration or whatever.
right.
And it's like the again that conflation that art should be political and it should be talking about the current thing du jour in the way that you want it to sound. A lot of writing has been devalued because of that, and like because it doesn't end up discussing like the topic du jour, if you will, or the social justice thing that everyone wants to hear. So I think that women have been better for obvious reasons just because they're women at writing about that stuff. And thus have gotten, more positive praise because they do, versus like I think if you just don't write about that at all, you're still gonna get the crowd that's like, so why does this even matter in the era of Trump,
Yeah.
And that's not good. So again, you're looking at it from a political standpoint versus like a literary standpoint.
And I mean, you got a creative writing degree, so you were sitting in workshops around this time, 2016 and
Yeah.
stuff like that. And I was in my MFA around that time, so I was sitting in grad school workshops at a, top 20 program or whatever, or when they still ranked it. Everybody's like, oh, we don't rank them anymore, but we do, right? Like,
Yeah.
we just don't release an official list, but everybody still remembers the list last time they ranked them. Uh, anyway, I remember sitting there, and there was just this thing. There was just this, if you are a straight male, it doesn't even matter if you're white or not, but if you're just a straight male and you're writing about sex, you will be just absolutely hammered in the workshop. In if you tried to publish it somewhere, like you would just be absolutely hammered with accusations of misogyny, all this stuff. And it was this kind of weird shift that happened right around when all the other weird shifts were happening because of this political thing, kind of an anti-Trump thing,
Hmm.
where it was just like, yeah, women are allowed to write about sex, gay men are allowed to write about sex however they want. It could be the most vulgar, raunchy shit in the world if it's a woman or a gay man writing it, or a
Romanticy,
tranny
yeah.
or something writing it. But if it's a straight man writing it, there's something inherently misogynistic and wrong or bad or missing or you don't understand. There was always this level. And I remember reading when I was studying this seriously, when you read about those kind of the new critics and the kind of feminist critiques of things that were happening really, which exploded through the 60s and 70s and all of that, and really has never stopped, just like the confessional stuff. There was a moment where it is like where the arguments against it were like, feminist critiques in literature, especially, and this can go for Marxist critiques as well, which have consumed everything, as you mentioned earlier. There's
Mhm.
this that like it's more about what isn't on the page than what is on the page. And
Does
it's
it
this
hit your
kind of,
checklist?
yeah, and it's this kind of, okay, so what are we doing here? What are we doing with the study of this then? Like if we're trying to study it from this specific lens and we're just making things up that aren't there because we wish they were, we're not actually doing like literary scholarship, although you could argue that's what literary scholarship has become. And that's one of my kind of hobby horses, sort of like it's all become, even the scholarship has become confessional in this weird way, where if you're writing about a work of art, it's about your personal confession on top of that work of art. And I get that. That's how you interpret a lot of art. That's fine, right? That's how people do it. But like, yeah, there's a guardrail that's missing now. There's the kind of all these political rules that come in and they come in haphazardly too. They come in randomly. They're not just like set across the board. Although maybe they are at publishing houses and things like that in the big five, etc. But it's just this weird thing that was happening with kind of, and it kind of ties into the whole kind of anti-sex thing, like how like kind of the progressive stuff is about, yeah, be who you are, polycules, have sex all the time, but also there's all these rules about it now that like didn't
Yeah.
exist before, and like you have to stick to these rules, and if you don't stick to these rules, like your life will be over. At least if you're a male, again, a straight male, I have to specify,
Yeah.
and I'm not saying that because of some homophobic thing, listeners. I'm saying that just because of the reality that I'm observing. Whereas like if you can write about gay sex all you want, you can't write about straight, at least from the male perspective. You can do it from the
Yeah.
female perspective, and you get as raunchy, as nasty, as graphic, as pornographic as you want. But there is this kind of restriction, and again, it's kind of artificial because, of course, with Substack and stuff, I could do that and just put it out, and no, it
Yeah.
doesn't matter, right? Of course, I could still do it, yes. But I'm talking about the institutional side, the kind of the
Yeah.
side that creates the magazines, that puts them out, that like
They'll
gets
give you money
funding,
for
yeah,
it.
that preserves the text, that like helps write the canon and all of that. That's what matters. So I don't know, it was just something where I was thinking about standards, and I was thinking about, yeah, this kind of, I mean, what we've been talking about this whole time, this kind of like Marxist critiques, feminist critiques, and I don't know if we're just moving beyond that because I feel like we have been a little stagnant in that post New Critics,
Oh,
and that
yeah.
was what pre-World War II. I
Yeah.
mean, that was like happening, and we've just been stuck in this for 100 years. We are trying to branch out and kind of understand that like it's more to it. I don't know. It's just yeah. So I was just very interested when I saw that article on your Substack. Go read it, listeners. It's linked below. Okay. Now we're going to get directly to writing your book and your writing routine and all of that. Where does the title Utter
Fantastic.
Goodness come from? How did you come up with that? How does it mesh, get all the stories together and all that?
So, utter goodness started as a phrase that for some reason was bouncing around in my head like a pinball, and I incorporated it into the titular story, utter goodness. And and again, that was a phrase that had no connections from anywhere, but I loved the idea of having this cult, and utter goodness is this like, both like a beef tallow that they're selling to fund themselves, as like this cow was like a holy thing to them, and that was the story, the collection started with the title American Girlfriend, actually, after the final story in the collection. Will and I at Farthest Heaven, he made the great point that one, this is, as I spoke earlier, this isn't that like girl lit disaffected female sort of a book at all. And so marketing it as American Girlfriend really fed into that in a way that we didn't think was accurate. Two, if you Google American Girlfriend, you're going to find a lot of weird people trying to find American girlfriends. So, from an SEO perspective, that didn't work. And we tried different titles. One of our favorites was States of Play, which unfortunately, then I Googled it and it's a book about soccer. So we couldn't go with that one. And we eventually landed on Utter Goodness because it's sort of, it's got that, quick utter goodness. It sounds great. And two, I think it really does sum up a lot of especially the faith-based themes of the collection, this sort of idea of utter, complete salvation and goodness. I always say that a lot of the stories in this collection, there is a very faith-based theme that runs through them, and a lot of them are that these characters are searching for something, to fill a spiritual sort of missing hole in their lives, and they fill it with being in a cult, they fill it with work, they fill it with relationships. And none of them have truly, achieved this faith in God or this self-actualization that might be utter goodness.
Right.
And I think a lot of the characters in the story are in search of that. So that's where that title came from. It started as just something bouncing around in my head. Couldn't tell you where it came from. Moved its way into this story, which is the title story. And then I think sort of became like this overarching theme of the collection as well. One fun thing is that I didn't realize until I showed the story Utter Goodness to Anna Krivalopova, fantastic writer by Incurable Graphomania. She was like, "Oh, utter, like utter, like of a cow." And I was like, I didn't even realize a double entendre until you just said it. Oh man. And so one of the things is we can't use a cow on the cover of the book. So
Uh,
the inclusion of utter goodness is the title about the story with cat involved cows, completely accidental actually, whether that was subconscious or not.
Maybe not. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting too when I think about how I'm just curious how that because you get something that sums up the entire collection. Yeah, that's a difficult thing to do or whatever. I remember I love Modest Mouse too, again, outing myself as a millennial here. And Isaac Brock would always talk about that. Again, he's one of the greatest song lyricists that in rock history, although he doesn't get his due just yet. It will
Mhm.
eventually. But he always said that naming an album, where he said
Yeah.
naming the album is very difficult. And they're like, why? He's like, well, just getting something that captures all of these, a dozen songs that we made. And he would usually take it from like a lyric somewhere, like a tiny
Yeah.
little lyric in the middle of a song that wasn't a single or anything like that. And it was like good news for people who love bad news or whatever. Yeah.
One
Great
of the
fucking
things
thing. Yeah. No,
One of
please.
Love Modest Mouse. One of the things too is when we were organizing the stories in the club, like where each one went, we really structured it like an album in
Right.
mind, and that's why like we started with Sparkle Time as this very like short. It's a very short story, but it introduces the collection and sort of a lot of the themes and the voice and the weirdness of the collection, almost like an intro to an album. And then we were like have the hits up front, some of them that have already been published, have some that haven't been published, or deal with different themes that might differ from the rest of the collection in the end, and then finish off with this like giant epic of American Girlfriend. So we really did try and structure it like someone might structure an album, which I really is something I like about the collection. And one of my beloved friends and Twitter mutuals, he writes this. He's floating sign on Twitter, and he put out a review of Utter Goodness yesterday in on his Substack, The Red Gaze, and he spoke about how it's like structured like an album, and I'm like, oh, awesome, people are seeing this, even though this obviously is not how it was marketed or like
Right.
something that we publicized. This is how we wanted to structure it. So,
Yeah. It's always, I had a poetry teacher. This is when it's a community college. Would say, do you want people to get what you wanted out of that work of art,
mhm.
or do you want them to do whatever they want to it, or like take whatever
Yeah,
they want? And like, it caused kind of a stir in the classroom, but I was always on the side of, well, you want them to get what you want out of it, right? And if
yeah,
they don't, well, then you failed at like doing it, right?
effective on it.
So when the
Yeah.
people start picking up, it's so rewarding to be like, yes, that's exactly what I was going for. But then also the opposite of that is true too, right? The frustration when people start just like pulling shit out of nowhere or something. You're like, fuck, did I not make that clear? Like, did I not make that
Yeah,
fucking clear?
right.
Like, what are you doing? But
I
yeah,
had someone
no,
call
please.
Harvesting Bunnies in the collection like a very just story. And that was one where, I think one of my critiques for myself in that story in particular was I'm not someone who loves to be a heavy-handed writer and sort of hammer you over the head with like the point. And well, also I still want to be, obviously successful in my intentions. And that is a story where I was like, this could be read as like a scorned wife story. For context, it's this woman who lives in rural Georgia, and she breaks her leg, and she's very in fear of her husband. And I'll leave it at that so you can kind of figure out the ending of it. But she sort of becomes what she fears. And that was one where I'm like, I don't want this to be a just woman or someone who, maybe. at the end, the husband cheats on her and I'm just going to spoil the whole thing. She kills him. And maybe that's some very biblical reading of just. I just read Plato's Republic in a reading group that is obviously all about what is justice. And so maybe from that level, like, sure, there's probably some ancient like Greek thing where it's like, yeah, it's just to kill an adult, someone who's done committed adultery. But this is obviously a story that takes place in the modern day. And I made her this very like delusional character in that she lives in this utter like fear of her husband. He's going to kill her, he's going to hurt her. He obviously sucks, but he never actually through the story does
Right.
anything to actually threaten her. He's never hit her before or done anything that has hurt her. And she um just develops this sort of utter, just increasingly paranoid fear that he is to the point where it becomes such an obsessive thing where she kills him. And that was one of those where I was like, that is my intention. I understand why people may read it, their ways, like a scorned woman story. Is this a just action on her behalf? But that's what I definitely wanted some more like nuance to it versus like man does bad thing to woman and she hurts him. I wanted some nuance to how is he actually versus how is she perceiving him versus like what is she and she ultimately becomes the one to cause harm.
Right.
So that's one of those examples where I'm like, I wonder if I could have done a better job at that. But I also like to see how different people interpret it too. And some people have gotten it. And I'm like, yes, yes,
Yeah.
you understood. So.
I didn't even think to ask you about this, but you mentioned faith too, in terms of finding faith and how it's a theme in the collection. Are you religious? Are you
Yes, I my faith in this is actually something that I think inspired a lot of the collection. Not any certain moments in my finding my Christian faith, but I grew up, and this goes back to like how I grew up. My family was like Creaster Christian, so we went to church Christmas and maybe Easter.
right?
And my parents did not come from religious families. My dad grew up in Southeast Asia. My grandparents were expats. They were not religious. And my mom's parents, my grandpa grew up in a Catholic family. My grandma grew up in a Protestant family. No one was happy when they got married for those reasons. And so they pretty much were like, we're not going to raise our kids in a faith because of this. And and I went to an Episcopalian high school, but I was very much like agnostic throughout my childhood. It wasn't
Right.
something I understood. It wasn't something that like I agreed with at that point, and just generally just something I didn't get, I think should be
Right.
the point here. And I started going to church in like late 2021, early 2022, when I was really having like a crisis of like, what do I believe in? What am I following? And my faith since then, I started in an Episcopalian church and I ended up at an Anglo-Catholic church for a while. I was just kind of going around different like denominations to figure out which one I did believe with, or like made the most sense to me. I have a lot of Catholic friends. They encouraged me to go to Catholic Mass, and so I've been going to Catholic Mass for about a year now. And that is one where I've sort of, found a space there and I can talk about what that makes sense to me. But I've sort of realized that a lot of my like personal crises and what I was searching for, what did I believe in, was due to a just spiritual sort of hole in me and nothing to fill it and nothing that, I tried to fill it with was fitting. Whether that would be partying, whether that would be politics, whether that would be, something
Right.
else. God has been what has filled that for me. And I think that sort of both consciously and subconsciously came up throughout writing the collection of, again, these right people trying to find what they believe in. I mean, starting off in Sparkle Time, that's someone who so strongly does not want to believe but can't help
Right.
but believe. And so I call myself a Christian right now because I am not like I was baptized Presbyterian actually, but I
When
haven't,
you were when you were a kid?
like 12
Oh, okay.
because it's church up the street. But again, my parents, my dad like volunteered there. Him and my
Yeah.
sister went on occasion, but we were not like a Presbyterian family. And so I think that I call myself a Christian right now because I haven't completely committed to one like sect of Christianity, but it's something where it's like I wanted to learn so much more about this and explore the beliefs between like Protestantism and Catholicism, so on and so forth, to find what I believe in before I make some commitment to exactly which like side of the Protestant, Catholic, etc. spectrum I commit to. I grew up in a very like despite not being like religious at all, like a very waspy sort of
Yeah.
values, Protestant values
You
family.
were a Mid-Atlantic
Um,
girl, yeah.
so I'm like, it's funny because when I talk about like Catholicism to them, and I still absolutely hold those values in myself. My mom's like, "Oh, the Catholics," and I'm like, "You haven't been to church in forever, mom. Like, you don't go." But it's funny because it's like that is what I've found like my faith to gravitates towards, while still holding these like very like WASP coded attitudes and values, which we all do. So,
Yeah, that's always interesting. I just asked because you brought it up and I was thinking, and it's something that I'm fascinated with, particularly that's part of the cultural moment we're in. Somehow that has been wrapped up in all of this politics as well. You know, the kind of
mm,
going to church is almost like a radical act of politics now. People post about it. People like, you know, all this kind of
yeah.
stuff that's happened now. It has become this, and maybe it always was kind of a symbol of something. Yeah, I just asked because I'm so fascinated, one, yeah, how people use it creatively and how it, you know, how it interacts with your everyday life and things like that. I am one of those people that I was raised Catholic. I was raised Catholic in Baltimore. I didn't even think about it, right? It was just I went to Catholic schools, all of that stuff. And Mass was just you just went to Mass when you went to Catholic schools. We just did it on like Fridays or whatever, like chapel or something. Never thought
Mhm.
anything about it. Got really into the new atheists when I was like coming out of high school there when I was like 17. And I still list people say intellectual heroes. I would still say Sam Harris and stuff is one of my intellectual, very important to my intellectual development, reading those books. Christopher Hitchens, another one of those like new atheist types. And I'm just so fascinated about like how that became the dominant cultural thing for a while, post the new atheist, post 2001, especially with 9/11. That was basically like Peter Thiel always has this great quote that said, being an atheist in the early 2000s was just an easy way to be anti-Islam, without having to deal with like the repercussions of saying you're anti-Islam or
Yeah.
whatever, you know? And I think there's some truth to that as well, particularly Sam Harris's stuff. The End of Faith, his book that came out around that time, post 9/11. And yeah, I'm just fascinated by that. Where I've, I would call myself atheist. That's how I would describe myself.
Mhm.
But there's like this part of me still like I wish I could not be, rather I wish I
Mhm.
could believe, right? Uh, but I just can't now. I don't know if I've been ruined by that or something, but I'm just fascinated about the faith itself now. And I think just the broad category of, you know, believing something and then what that does for you, you know, like what it gives
Yeah.
you, what it takes from you, all of those things that come into why. Because even people, you know, a lot of people would argue this and they always do that. Even atheism itself is a belief, right? You believe something
Yeah.
like this. And I think there's some truth to that. So it's like, okay, like, you know, why do you get anything out of it? And somebody like Harris, when you brought up the kind of the spiritual whole, he's one of the few new atheists that would talk about like if we eliminate religion, there will be a spiritual whole in human
Mhm.
beings after this. And he would say, you know, meditation or something, you know, other kind of, again, very
New age.
spiritual practices that don't necessarily involve the belief in a God or something. So I get people kind of are like, that's a little wishy-washy, and I think it is too. Yeah, it's kind of like, oh, how do you deal with that? So I'm just fascinated by that, and I think it's just a more interesting question right now of people were like, oh, is God real or not? Well, that was the interesting question in 2001, you know,
Yeah.
like, but the interesting question now is, like, I think, is faith, belief. What does it happen? Why does it matter? You know, and why are we suddenly flocking back, especially younger, like Gen Z, like flocking back to this thing that we had originally kind of maybe in the last 20, 30 years. Maybe you could go even further. I know some people, some scholars argue as, oh, it started in the 60s, post Vatican II, or whatever. People are always talking about that. But I think it was just, yeah, just an interesting cultural shift. And then the faith being used in literature, it's a tradition. It's happened all the time. I mean, like using
Yeah.
Bible, all of this stuff. And I think that hurt the lack of faith, or at least the lack of understanding of faith, is hurting literature too. Whereas just kind of like,
Yes.
I remember because I was raised Catholic and grew up in Catholic schools, by the time I got to college, there were people that just wouldn't recognize like, you know, allusions to like the Bible stories or something in literature. I'm
Mhm.
sitting in grad school and I'm just like, are you fucking stupid? Like, what are you taught? Like the loaves and it's right here on the page. Like it's right here. Like, have you never heard this story before? And they hadn't heard that story before. They confused it. They didn't recognize it or something. And I was like, yeah, so that is hurting kind of even an understanding of art now too. I don't know. And then that ties into people not having that right. And there's all kinds of theories about why people go into politics instead of that. Now they're using that to
Yeah.
fill the spiritual void or moral authority or something. They're using that to fill the spiritual void. And then there's always interesting arguments where it's like the moral authority that people from the progressive left right now that is like dominating everything is kind of like the Ten Commandments in a way too.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of already there. Like they're just like redoing what already existed for thousands of years.
Like reinventing that from the
Yeah.
principles. Like,
So I'm
and
just fascinated by it. Please, please.
I think too, I've thought a lot about like, 'cause obviously a lot of like Gen Z, my son, I'm a zillennial, if you will, like younger people who's pretty much their upbringing and memory was post 9/11. Is that, and I'm going to go back to Lash and the me generation here and how the looking towards the self for like total self sort of like security and absolution, obviously drew a lot of like, boomer types or like especially Gen X types
Yeah.
away from religion. You find your total sort of happiness and moral compass more in less from religion and more in like the self and what you believe. And I think something that I've posted about, and I actually would love to like write an essay about this more. I think I've started one and tried is
Yeah, you should. Yeah.
how thinking about yourself too much will make, and I actually did, I think I touched a little bit on this in you might be writing about yourself too much, is that I think thinking about yourself too much and being way too self-introspective is overall like detrimental for yourself and your like mental health. You become just sort of your own worst critic. And that is a downside of this me generation because
Right.
and everything after that, because people look towards them inwards way too much at themselves for, am I a happy person? Am I a good person? And less towards, say, like, again, your community, your church, your God. Are you in service of, something external of
Right.
you? That I think is when you stop thinking about yourself and all these insecurities, that doing that, raises up, you can be a much more directed and happier person. And I think, I lived in Utah for a little bit. This is why the Mormons, I think, succeed. I
Yeah.
don't agree with Mormonism on a theological level, but when 60% of your state is Mormon, and Mormons are very much like structured around community, and it's all very external, like within your parish, that's your life. You know everyone there. You're there every multiple times a week, and the Mormons have a huge sort of like net of like safety net of like if you've had a family member that's died, if you lost your job, if you're like having marriage problems, there's always someone in your community you can go to. And it's this, and everyone's sort of in service to each other. So it's this very external, mission driven, of course, culture. And Mormons are some of the happiest people like
Right.
on earth. If you want to in terms of studies, if there's been like qualitative studies about this, or quantitative studies, I should say, about this. And I think that they are like a completely sort of like example of what maybe used to be and what that 60s me generation onwards now to like again our very introverted, very therapy speak antisocial culture has lost. And I think that that is a reason why a lot of younger people were isolated during the pandemic and grew up in a lot of families didn't grow up with faith as a strong thing, mine included, in the household. And that's why a lot of younger people are turning to religion and Christian faith and church, because it is a way of, finding happiness and finding your moral compass and being in service to something larger than yourself that we just didn't grow up with. So,
Yeah. I think I mean, obviously it's not a new point, but I think it's accurate and
mhm.
it's interesting in terms of, yeah, like the spiritual void was filled with this kind of narcissism for a while there. The
Yeah,
culture on the internet does encourage that. But then, as I think you rightfully pointed out, it eliminates these very human things that religion kind of codified in these easy to understand parables or even like Ten Commandments or something, right? Charity, grace. And then, of course, having charity
mhm.
and grace with yourself, right? Let alone, if you can't do it with yourself, well, then you're not going to be able to do it with the external
Anyone
world,
else.
yeah, and anybody else. We're giving people a little grace or a little charity, or yeah, I mean, I think that's a huge problem in the discourse, obviously, especially, people can say whatever they want in comment sections and things, or going back and forth, even if you're a public journalist or something, going back and forth with some rando on Twitter whatever. That's not like, a prestigious publication. But sometimes these people just like put shit in these like the prestigious publications that just put out some of the most fucking vile, uncharitable, bad faith nonsense
Yeah.
where there's no grace, there's no charity, there's nothing like that at all. It's actually the worst interpretation you could do, and it's so bad faith that it's kind of disgusts me when I look at it. And I'm just like, that's getting published in supposedly the most, in the most, not even supposedly, these are the most prestigious publications in the world. The
Yeah.
New York Times, the New Yorker, these types of publications. I mean,
The Vanity Fair more
yeah,
recently.
yeah,
I think too something on this and something that I, explored somewhat abstractly in utter goodness is like tabloid culture. I
yeah,
obviously grew up in the era of like going to the grocery store and seeing just celebrities getting eviscerated on like tabloid covers. And of course, it's a lot of like gay men who are writing about women. And there's no grace there. Obviously, there's no charity to Mariah Carey gained 2 pounds and now she looks like a fat cow or
right.
whatever. And I think that. And that obviously gets a lot of attention. And I think, where was I going with this? I think that was sort of like, in Utter Goodness in particular, the characters are very much judging each other throughout it. And some, whether explicitly or not, and they don't give each other a lot of grace a lot of the time. I think it really wanted to explore this hypercritical, culture that we live in, where whether you're doing it out of just like compulsiveness to appease how you feel about yourself, making yourself feel better, or like more as like a surveillance state thing. That was something, especially in like American Girlfriend, that I wanted to explore more. All of these sort of bad moments about ourselves. Being treated with very little, again, ch grace to them, or being given very little charity. So that was something that I touched lightly on in the collection, and I think there's a gossipy quality to the collection that touches on that as well.
Yeah. What is your writing routine like? How do you like to do it?
I am someone who has to write everything all at once or nothing at all. I want to start working on a novel again, and that's something where it's like I'm not someone who can do like 200 words a day willy-nilly here or there. I need to go like total body fascism for like 2 months. Total writing fascism is my joke here, and like have a routine where I lock myself in my office and make sure I hammer out 2,000 words a day and not leave the office until like said 2,000 words are hammered out. And I need to do that until the novel is written. So it's very much when I start to, and also when I write a short story, for example, I have to get it on paper all at once. It's rarely something that I can like work on. Once I get rolling with it, like rarely something that I can do in bits and pieces, sort of a thing. I will write something, and then I found that like I get my best sort of revision ideas in like a hot yoga class. I'll be in like downward dog and be
Yeah.
something will just click in my head, and I'll be like, oh my God, gotta get home and like write that out. So I'll stay up writing for like hours once I get an idea. I very much don't have like a traditional routine, if you will. If I do have a routine, it is that I have a personal rule for myself. This is also why I read so much, where I have to read or write just a little something every day. I don't set a minimum for myself. I don't set like you have to read at least 10 pages or write at least this many words, because that gets discouraging really fast. I've never been good at that. But if I, read for 5 minutes, cool, I did it. If I tried to write something, if I started off a Substack essay, cool, I did it. And if I actually end up writing a whole thing, even better. And that's become something that's been very good for like my reading and writing practice, because I'm doing something good for that at least a little bit every day. Whether or not I end up then spending the next 3 hours, 6 hours, whatever, getting down a short story draft. So, um, I definitely am someone who, and I work a full-time job, lead a life outside of this. So it's something that I would love to be one of those people, as we all do, who sits down and writes 200 words a day and drinks their tea. But I'm someone who needs to lock herself in a dark room for 2 hours on end and get
Right.
something on paper. But because, just staying in practice, having my little like reading a little bit, writing a little bit a day rule really helps with that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you just set time or just whenever you can fit it in for your kind of
Whenever I can
daily?
fit it
Yeah.
in, I'll read on my lunch break, write out,
Right.
right before bed or something. so on and so forth. So just sort of whenever I can fit it in during the day. I've found that to be more productive than being like, you have to write 300 words a day or whatever. Because once I stop writing, once I feel like I'm pulling teeth writing 300 words a day, I stop it because it's
Right.
not really working. And I found that that sort of practice of not setting a minimum for yourself is, and also obviously not setting a maximum, is a really good system for myself.
What when you're doing this, like when you're piecing it together, we like these kind of details on the show where there's kind of, are you during those sessions, are you kind of giving like, yeah, like a kind of piecing it together later when you're getting those big long writing marathons, kind of piecing these little sections that you have, like almost like you said, puzzle pieces with poetry and stuff, like kind of
Yeah.
putting the puzzle pieces into place. You're like, oh yeah, I had this idea here and I wrote, a paragraph or two on it. I can throw it in here and rewrite it real quick and it'll fit. I don't know, just is that part of the process where you like to do
Oh yeah,
this? Or
for sure. If I have like an idea somewhere, I will absolutely use that time to pull it in. That's something, and that's why I never like delete drafts of stories. And even if something like I started and I made it two paragraphs in and it totally flopped, it's gonna stay in my Google Drive for the rest of eternity because I never know when I'm gonna want to pull that in
right.
again.
Do you handwrite, type? What are your preferences?
I
Both?
type.
Type.
I'm usually not a handwriter for fiction as much, or anything at that regard. But I am definitely just a typer. So
Yeah, it's weird too because I have a weird thing with that too, where poetry I like to handwrite first drafts, but
yeah.
then for fiction it just takes too long to do that, right? You can type
Mhm.
faster than you can write. So like but then like when you go to type up a poem after that, that's an editing process for the second draft now. Like it starts to edit things out. I think the same thing when you do the rewrite or something after the first draft for longer form. I don't know, so it's just the type of thing we like to hear about from writers on this show. Because
The
that's the work, man, right? Like that's
yeah,
the work. Like everyone's like, "Oh, you wrote this book, that's great." But it's like, yeah, but this is like the years, the grind of like
yes.
doing this.
I
That's
did.
what writing is. Yeah.
I cannot. My only thing is I can never write on a phone. Like I
Yeah.
hate typing out long texts. I can't believe Olivia Nuzzi apparently wrote American Canto on her phone. That is a truly sociopathic behavior to me. So not so.
She was kind of sociopathic when the
I mean,
details
well,
came out. Yeah.
yes. It totally makes
She
sense.
was,
I
I mean,
feel
I say that, but like she was kind of a millennial. Like,
yeah.
yeah, acting like a
Um,
millennial.
but I also have done I when I did more poetry, I definitely started with like handwritten drafts. I think because having paper too, when you're crossing stuff out and whatnot, you don't have to just delete it to get it off the
Yeah. Right.
page. You can sort of cross it out and scribble in your margins and stuff. So I think that's especially a helpful process for poetry. I do like to edit on paper. I do
Yes.
like to print out stories and go to town with a pen.
Yeah.
Track changes has the same purpose to me, but I find it a lot easier to sort of visually get down those edits and those changes with just a pen and paper.
100%. I love that. And I think more people should. I think that the disgrace in terms of internet content full of typos is because when you work as an editor at some of these magazines now, like everything's on a screen with track changes,
Yeah,
or even worse, it's in Google Docs with the track
yeah.
changes that you're sharing through everything. And you just, there have been studies. If it's on a piece of paper, you retain more of what you just read,
Mhm.
and like you can spot the errors better. At least I can. Like, there's a difference between if I edit something on a screen, I am missing at least 4 or 5% of grammatical things, all the little period, whatever it is. Uh, just because I don't know what it is, there's something about our brains where we're looking into a screen where we just don't quite comprehend it as well as if we're just looking at that page with the black, ink on it or whatever. I don't know, just something about it. Like I can see the difference. And so like I know that even if people aren't noticing this, that's led to a huge
Mhm.
shift in like quality coming out of a lot of these magazines because it's always just done on a screen. Even editing books nowadays, most of the time is on a
Yeah,
screen before publication. So you have these embarrassing typos in a published manuscript because it was just edited on a screen. It wasn't like the editor was bad. It was just the editor like was on a
yeah,
screen and you just missed that little detail or that little misspelling or whatever it is. And now the whole publisher is embarrassed because of it. I get it's probably more expensive to print it out, but I'm just like, yeah, we're losing. It just
yeah.
makes so much more sense to do it printed out than it does to do it on a screen. Yeah.
Your eyes and brain are also just going to start hurting after staring at a screen
Yeah.
for a while. So you're going to start missing stuff. You get fatigued from it.
The last couple questions here, we can do them quickly. Thank you for
Yeah.
staying with me, Audrey.
No worries. I didn't realize it's like 4 p.m. here. I'm like, oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
yeah, I appreciate that. This is going to be a great episode. Yeah,
Yeah.
we like to ask writers, we don't need numbers. How do you make a living? We kind of went into it already, but we like to ask, how
Yeah.
do you make a living? Do you make any money off the writing, Substack stuff? And the reason we ask this is because, it's rough out there for writers. Most people have
Yeah.
to have a day job. We've had, MBA winners on the podcast, and they say the same thing, right? They have to teach for
Yeah.
a living. They have to run private workshops, whatever it is. Yeah. So hey, how do you make a living?
Yeah, so I'm a pharmaceutical marketer in my day job, sign of the cross, I know. And I've always been in marketing. In college, I was like, well, I'm an English major, I'm a creative writing major, but I don't actually want to do like what the typical like English major jobs are, which was like teacher, copywriter, barista, or like academia. And so I was like, so something I was like, you know what I can do? I can tell stories. Let me go try and work in marketing. I did a bunch of internships throughout college, and that got me into specifically search engine optimization
Right.
and like
And
web
that was
dev.
big like 10 years ago. Yeah, that was
It's still,
literally the
hey, I'm
thing.
sorry,
Yeah,
as an SEO, it's still big.
that's true.
And so, and I've also gotten to work at like startups where you end up wearing like 10 hats instead of just
Hmm.
what's on your job title. So I definitely have a stronger, like again, digital organic search DevOps background sort of a thing. So, and I say that's also really good as a writer because if I was a copywriter, if I was someone who was on the creative narrative side of things, I would get so burnt out from doing that all day for my job, I would never actually write. And this is one of those things that it's like if I'm just staring at spreadsheets or code all day, I can do that, and then I can come home and do my like Word document stuff. And I also am someone who appreciates stability. And having a salaried job with health insurance really gives you the stability to be a writer. Like if I was a writer who was doing freelancing all the time and didn't have sort of like a month to month stable paycheck or like know when that was coming in, I think my writing would suffer overall and I would have a lot more fear about that. And, people talk about the starving artist type, and that's just not something that I'm maybe willing to do. And I think it's been good for me. Like I've obviously still been able to publish my work and work on a Substack. And one of my goals for this year is to go do a lot more with the Substack. Obviously, at some point in my life, I would love to be a full-time writer, but I am someone who's also like very financially conservative. So
Right.
I would have to be making some good money to
Right.
that I knew would be continually coming in to like fully quit a 9 to 5. So I do make some money off of the Substack.
Right.
Obviously, royalties are nice. But it's not something, especially when you put out a lot of your work online for no cost or low cost, that you make a lot of money off
Right.
of. So I do want to go into just, for a novel, like go with a traditional publishing house. So, when we reach that hill, we'll climb it or whatever. But I think that having the stability of like, again, your steady paycheck, your health insurance, your 9 to 5 is really beneficial because
Yeah.
you you're good. You can write all you want otherwise, and you're not going to be worried about it.
Yeah. And everybody, writing is one of those fields, maybe just because like the top 1% are the ones that get all the kind of attention, media and
Mhm.
marketing. But everybody likes to use the exception to disprove the rule, in writing particularly. So they like to point to the Stephen Kings, or even let's not even go that far because that's top 1% of 1%. Let's
Yeah.
talk like, the Substack political writers or something that are making, 500K a year, a million a year off of their Substack subscribers. I think even those numbers sound better than they are. Of course, I mean, those are great numbers if you're writing for a living. But yeah, a lot of those people, Iglesias, all these people that left their kind of stable health insurance providing jobs. Okay, so now you don't get the taxes taken out of those checks. So you just cut that in
Yeah.
half, cut that number in half right off the bat because the taxes, you haven't paid any of them yet. And then, of course, it's like, yeah, you don't have insurance. You have to buy your own insurance. So it's like, okay, yeah, they're
Yeah.
still making a great living doing this, 6 figures writing. That's a great living for any writer. That's unbelievable. Top 1% for being a writer for a living.
Oh yeah.
Uh, but still, it's not as much as it always sounds like, too. So I like to dispel the myth that there's all these millionaire writers out there, where there's just a handful.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it just is crazy how that I mean that's part of the economic incentive, that's part of the cultural stuff that's changing. It's part of how the internet has changed how we consume this stuff too. Like nobody is buying books. There's a very small
Mhm.
percentage of the population, like me and Audrey and those of you listening, that buy books and read them and cherish them and fetishize them and worship them, etc., etc. and that's it. It's like 1
Yeah.
to 3% of the population that does that, and then we're just on our own. It's just rough out there. I just don't know what happened, but something has shifted to where nobody cares and nobody really even wants to bother to read it. Even the real popular books, I see that all the time where I'm like, book sales are going down and somebody will put one of the exceptions in my face, like Otessa Moshfegh or somebody like that. Like they'll throw like one of the exceptions in my face or like some random literary, you know, doing the
Yeah.
diaspora typical thing or whatever, minority diaspora somehow. And then like it kind of they'll say that, oh, that sold 3 million copies. And I'm like, yeah, okay, like that's the exception, not the rule,
Yes.
right? Like that's the exception to like what's happening here. And yeah, I get they probably made most of their money off that book that year, the publishing house, but it's still like that's the exception. And like if we're only trying to market and promote exceptions, we're never going to succeed in this.
Yeah.
Like it's going to crumble under its own weight. Maybe that's happening. Maybe there's still enough money coming in through those exceptions that it doesn't matter. So I think people overblown the kind of collapse narratives
Hmm.
politically, of course, and then people, oh, the United States is collapsing. No, fuck, it isn't.
Yeah.
But then, like, I think for something for publishing too. I think people overestimate that kind of collapse narrative with publishing, particularly the big five presses. And it's just interesting to see, okay, somebody coming from like Audrey, for example, totally independent, coming up through the ranks, and then like, yeah, going through small presses for the first call, and then trying to get to those big, like it's still there. Like people are out there doing that, like, and that's the
Yeah.
way to go forward with it. And it's just like, so there's a hunger for that too. There's a hunger for these independent writers who are not getting published in the New Yorker or all these Washington Post, whatever it is, and they're making a living. So it's there, but it's just yeah, just so crazy how that's working out now with everything. And I mean, I'm fascinated by it, and then listeners are fascinated by it because it's just a lot of the listeners are yeah, people trying to be writers, all of that, and
Yeah.
it just never
No, I
ends.
think sort of continually surprised, like with Substack, like, oh yeah, people want to pay for my
Right,
writing. And we may be like, again, readers and writers be like a self-sustaining economy where we're all writers and we're all reading each other's stuff. And that might be just way too much of a like an overgeneralization. Because again, it's a very small percentage of the population. But I will say if there's one thing with institutions and they're maybe not propping up the best, but there is still money there, I guess. And I think that, but for like independent writing in particular, like you said, there's still a hunger for it, and there's a desire and like an unmet need for books like that Farthest Heaven puts out. And I think it's great that we still have that, even if it's very small at this point.
right.
It's, I'm going to keep writing no matter what. So,
Yeah, fantastic. Last question, Audrey, we like to ask.
yep.
Read anything good, watch anything good, listening to anything good. What's filling your head?
Ooh.
And this can be anything. Yeah, this could be reality TV, this could be high literary, whatever is filling your head.
So I have this ongoing thing because I am very like protective about what I think I ingest media
Yeah,
wise. This is why I'm like I take a lot of pride in like what I read, and want to focus on more like what you would call like highbrow literature or something that brings something new to the conversation. And I would say the same with like this is why I stay off of TikTok and like Instagram is because that can immediately fill your head with like a lot of slop. And I don't watch a lot of movies, I will say, and I try and really watch like good movies. But one of the things that I do let my guard down on is television. I love to like just and watch awful television. So I mean, to be fair, so my thing right now is Desperate Housewives. And I do love Desperate Housewives. It's a ridiculous show. It's actually really well written and really funny. And I wouldn't call it, it's somewhere in this weird thing between like it's not a soap opera, it's not reality TV, it's not that bad, but it's also maybe not like a Sopranos
yeah.
quality or like HBO moment there. But it's just really an enjoyable sort of juicy show. And the other thing is like Secret Lives of Mormon Wives. Probably that's the lowest common denominator of television. Huge fan of that.
Oh yeah.
On the other end of the like spectrum, I guess I just finished reading Cowboy Graves by Roberto Bolaño, author of, Savage Detectives, 2666. Not my favorite book of his, but it had been sitting on my shelf for a while, so I am happy
Right.
I finished it. And again, I'm staring over my bookshelf. I would say also like music wise, I do listen to a lot of music. I've always, as we talked about earlier, like bands and stuff, I've always been I am not a musician, but I'm a big music person. Um, and I more recently am getting like, my dad is a huge Rush fan. So I'm getting back into Rush for some reason. I don't know. It's funny because I run a lot. So my running music is always like, classic rock stuff. And because somehow like modern music just doesn't cut it for me. But classic rock really cuts it for me with running. So I think I have a pretty, I'm like, 1 second, what am I listening to now? So I think it's a good mix of things. Like I really am sort of protective of what I consume. And but at the same time, I give myself a little bit of grace
Yeah.
there with like watching just absolute trash reality television, but like nothing else.
Yeah. I just love things. Obviously, my metric is it good? So I
Hmm.
don't care. I love Stephen King stuff. I love that kind of shit. I love my wife and I watch 90 Day Fiance. We've been watching it for
Hmm.
years, every week. We That's one of my reality TV shows. And yeah, I like prestige drama. I'm a writer.
Yeah.
I like prestige drama. I care about, like you said, Desperate Housewives is so well written. It's like, yeah, because that was made at a
Yeah.
time when TV writing still mattered. I'm actually doing that with a series where we're covering Modern Family and how it was the last American sitcom.
Hmm.
Go listen to those episodes, listeners, because of that type of thing. The way it was made and written was the last kind of gasp of old Hollywood kind of style to write shows and just have great snappy pieces, great bits, great one-liners, just constantly. It's very tight, 22-minute, tight little
Yeah.
thing that they do. And it just works. It's just, wow, the craft has deteriorated when you look at like Netflix, what they call slop, right? That kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
very
think that's because a lot of stuff now, like their quippy lines, they want to do it so it gets like memed into
right,
existence. So, you're writing basically for 15 to 20-second TikTok clips.
right.
But I do love Desperate Housewives, and I am about to start season 3, so that's fun. So,
I remember when it aired, I would watch it.
yeah.
I was in middle school and I watched like the first couple episodes or something with a girlfriend and it was just
Mhm.
obviously not for me, but like yeah, I barely remember it, but I remember how like attractive the women were. That was like one
Of
of the things
course, of
that yeah,
course.
because that's back when you still casted people to be attractive too, like on TV at least. Like you want to see beautiful people in TV and movies, yeah.
I see a little too much of myself in Vanderkamp for me to feel good about. So she's the redhead. So
Yeah. Oh, well, Audrey, this has been fantastic. It went way longer. Thank you for staying with me because the
yeah.
conversation was just so good. Where
Yeah.
can people
Well,
find
let's
you?
talk about.
Yeah, where can people
I'm
find
sorry.
you?
Oh yeah. How do
Handle,
people find me?
Substack, and this is all linked below as
Yep.
well, but just yeah.
Yep. So I am on Substack, John Didion, JAWN Didion.substack.com. My book, Utter Goodness, is obviously out with Furthest Heaven. You can get that on Furthest Heaven's website. I'm on Twitter at Tinned Fishmonger, Tinned without an E, thanks to Twitter's character limits. And I am online at audreymorganlee.com. Instagram, if you really want, that's eternally online. My first book launch party for Utter Goodness is this upcoming Thursday, January 22nd at Photo Lounge in Philadelphia. That's starting at 7 p.m. Also features some great writers, John Pinto and Kevin Costello. And we're just announcing, so you heard it here first, maybe, although we are announcing it Monday, so we'll see. The DC reading is going to be at Butterworth's in Capitol Hill. That is on February 22nd. And it'll be a panel and a reading with fellow Furthest Heaven writers, Tom Will and Anna Krivalopova. So really looking forward to that and more details to come.
Fantastic. You heard it there, listeners, and that's all linked below as well. Audrey, please come back. Please come back
Would love
anytime.
to.
Cover a
Anytime. Thank
book.
you so much.
Yeah, literary culture, anything. Yeah, we're always open here.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Andrew.
Of course.
Heavy.
bored,
Heavy.
I am heavy, heavy, heavy.
bored,
I may say male is entirely hostile.
no,
Inner
Resources.
life
shows such a lack of gratitude for life. Bored. I aspire to boredom, I should say.
Bored. Heavy.
I am heavy.
Bored.
Has you the night sweats and the day sweats, pal? Pal, I do.